Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. For a very quick update, the breaker in our house fried. So we've been in a hotel and an Airbnb for the last week while it gets fixed. But because of that, I haven't been able to record a new TSR episode for this week, but I have a very special treat for you instead. So last week I aired my massive 12-hour-long compilation video of Dr. Michael Heiser interviews that I've done throughout the years, and that video has absolutely blown up, like more than I thought it would. A lot of people really enjoyed having this resource available. So for this week, I'm going to air my latest and best top 3 full interviews from Dr. Ken Johnson, and these are the full episodes that aren't available anywhere else outside of the Daily Renegade website. If you do not have a subscription to Daily Renegade yet, then this will give you a sneak peek into what you're missing. So we do this for all of our videos. So if you like what you see here in this sneak peek, then head on over to dailyrenegade.com and get a membership today. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year, and if you can do it, I suggest getting the $100 a year because it's technically cheaper in the long run. Essentially, you get 2 months for free doing it that way. Now, if all goes to plan, we should be back next week with new content, and as always, members of Daily Renegade will get early access to the new content and the full video. Members will be the first to see it and the only ones to see the full video, so you don't want to miss out on that. All right, timestamps for today's video are included in the description below, so without further ado, here are my top 3 full interviews with Dr. Ken Johnson, never before seen, for free on YouTube or Rumble. Make sure you subscribe, click the bell for all notifications, and enjoy. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there is a big difference between real money and what we call money, which is actually just currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, on the other hand, like silver, for example, is a store of value over time. The best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash back in the late 60s, the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000 technically, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. Now, if you had saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 1960s, today it would be worth around $28,000. So one of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically, silver. You can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even a 401k into physical silver rather than having all of your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is subject to hyperinflation. Go to dailyrenegade.com and click on the Cornerstone Assets Metals banner. This is the only company that I personally trust with this kind of thing. Click on that and sign up to get your free silver report today. One of the financial experts will speak with you to find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times. Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Tonight we have a very special returning guest, Dr. Ken Johnson, to talk about his most recent release, The New Covenant of Damascus, the Damascus Document, Community Rule, 4Q Instruction, and Related Material. Welcome back to the show, Ken. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Oh yeah, anytime. You're one of my favorite guests. Since your last appearance, we've had some new subscribers join up. So in case somebody is brand new to this topic, can you just give us like a brief rundown of who the Essenes are and what are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, basically, the Essenes are the Zadok priests that we see from the Old Testament, the descendants of Aaron, and they were supposed to be the priests. And in time, an apostasy hit, and you've got Sadducees and Pharisees and other cults that rose up, took over the priesthood, ran them out, and basically that's the history that starts off in Matthew, where you've got all these different divisions. But they're the ones that kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the proper interpretations of Scripture, the commentaries on the prophecies, the writings from the school of the prophets, and the like.
Excellent. You start the book off with Zadok history and Zadok beliefs. Can you give us the some of the background on the Zadokites?
Yeah, basically, they said that apostasy was supposed to form, which involved the calendar and the rituals and the belief systems. The Pharisees and Sadducees started teaching there was no Holy Spirit, the Messiah was just a man, there's no virgin birth, etc. Their records from the school of the prophets indicate the exact opposite. So they basically said that's a lie, we're not going to have any part of it. And they were persecuted, hunted down, and exterminated for the most part. And so they picked up and they moved to Egypt and created a small temple and complex there. Egypt didn't care what you worshiped as long as you paid taxes, so that was fine. But to the north, you had to convert to Greek philosophy or die. That's where we get all the stories about the Maccabees and that kind of stuff. So they were told, they actually said that they had a Christophany and were able to pull everything together. And they were told to wait there in Egypt until the prophecy of Daniel was fulfilled that Rome would step in, and that would basically fix the assassinations and that kind of stuff. Then they were to go back into Israel, and one from their order would be the one to usher in the Messiah, the prepare the way of the Messiah, of which John the Baptist said he was that one.
Yeah, it's really interesting how all of this connects with biblical accounts that we're all familiar with, but it really helps shed some light and give a broader context to what's really going on. What is the Damascus document, and why is that so important?
The Damascus document is probably the main document as to what they believed and why. And most people just kind of skim over it because it's like, okay, if you're in a scene, you wear this, you eat this, we don't care. But it's not so much that as it is why they did, what they believed about it, what the Holy Spirit told them to do, and how the apostasy formed. It's more of a history and theology put together. And so for our time period, it's really important because they said that several things go in cycles. So the end times of our time, right before the second coming, would be very similar. And so they give real good practical advice on what to do and what not to do.
Excellent. The Damascus document in your book, it's split up into four parts. I'd love to go through some of these. Let's start with the first, history. What does it teach about the history of the Zadok order?
Basically, that they were the original priests, and then factions arose, much like if you and I said, if you're a Baptist and I'm a Calvary Chapel, it'd be like, well, we do things a little differently, but we're Christians. It doesn't really matter. But there are other people that come up and they'd be part of a full-blown cult, but they claim to be Christian too. And so it's that kind of a deal. I mean, you can debate on how the prophecies are going to unfold, but you have to follow like Mosaic law for them. And so the cults arose, they changed the calendar system. It talks about how all of Israel was walking in madness in that last set of years. Basically, the Sadducees said that we're the real guys, we're the ones that are supposed to run the government. So if you hold your fork wrong on Sabbath, it's a capital offense, we have to kill you. And then the Pharisees were saying the same thing, and all these different groups always trying to kill each other for stupid things. They lost their ability to govern. And so that's basically what happened. But the prophecies are pretty interesting. The theology part is that they have always believed that the Messiah would be God incarnate. He would come to pay the penalty for our sin nature, which would reconcile us to God. And that event happens one Shemitah after the end of the ninth Jubilee of their age, which for our calendar is 32 AD. Give or take a year, but still, they had it all pinpointed. And there's lots of other prophecies given in those things, like the veil of the temple would be ripped in half when the true Messiah dies. And so there's a whole lot of different things in there, but the basic theology is what the patriarchs taught, and Moses said the same thing, or the Old Testament does. It's just that the cults had reinvented everything. So the theology is amazing, and it's really important because not so much to us because we look at the New Testament and go, yeah, we knew all that. But the Jews today who are told to stay away from Christians because it's all made up are learning that their great great grandfathers believed much the same. And it's really interesting because if the oldest text have a Christian theology, maybe there's something to it. And there's actually a lot of people now that are, a lot of Jews that are becoming messianic.
That's phenomenal, and to me, that's one of the most important things about the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially for our day and age when we're. I mean, it seems like you turn on the news channel every day, and some prophecies being fulfilled again.
Hmm.
And so yeah, time's getting short, and it's good that this stuff is coming out now. The next section that you have concerns the priestly laws for Israel. What can you tell us about those?
Basically, they were similar. What is I think is really interesting is the Sadducees would only talk to Sadducees. If you're not part of our denomination, you're trash. Pharisees, on the other hand, would talk to anybody who's Jewish. All Jews are brothers, but Gentiles are trash. And the Essenes had a completely different look. It's like it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, Jew or a Gentile. If you want to believe in Messiah and want to study the prophecies, you're brothers and sisters. Now, when they're on duty to do temple rituals, no one can touch them or, talk to them or anything because they're doing a ritual. So they believe that they had to continue to fulfill the law of Moses to the letter until the age of grace started. And so they were very careful to do that kind of thing. But it's interesting for them to talk about the idea that, Huldah was a prophetess, so there's always exceptions. So it's the Holy Spirit picks whom he wants, when he wants, how he wants. And we serve the Holy Spirit. We don't serve the temple priesthood. And it's really interesting to see there's a whole lot of history of the things that they talked about. Supposedly, they talk about a prophetical timeline in Jubilees and Shemitahs on who did what and what was going to happen all the way through the time period. They talked about how there are multiple ages and there should be 7,000 years of time between Adam's creation and the creation of a new heavens and a new earth. Now, we can speculate on that being real or not, but they were known by Josephus and all the other historians to be 100% accurate prophets and healers. And so, what's interesting about it is all the extra biblical prophecies and then the commentaries on like the minor prophets that we have from them all point to what's happening in Rome at that time, and they seem to be 100% accurate. So a good 80% of it deals with first coming stuff, but there are things in there about the second coming. So I would assume that would be very important for us to know. And some of the practical terms are the idea that, in a time of light, you go out and witness, and if somebody gets mad, who cares? But in a time of darkness, that's dangerous. Think of communist China. You get yourself killed. So there's ways to witness and ways not to. And sometimes you have to pull away from society to protect your family, to live godly, and things like that. And they give a lot of wise, really interesting points of their theology. There's actually whole things, when you go through the New Testament and look at Paul's writings, for instance, he talks about the gifts of the Spirit and things like that. Those lists are almost identical in the Damascus covenant. So the same concepts of what Paul taught. I just think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. You have priestly laws for camp dwellers as well. How does that compare and contrast with the previous priestly laws?
Well, basically, the idea was you can be a Zadok priest and do priestly stuff, much like you could be a Levitical priest and be a Pharisee or Sadducee or whatever. Paul was a Pharisee, but he was of the tribe of Benjamin, so he couldn't do any priestly stuff at all. So the same kind of thing applies. You and I would believe in the Essene theology instead of Pharisee or Sadducee, but we wouldn't be priests. We would probably live in the cities, have wives, children, families, businesses, just normal people. And then other people would try to go out to the countryside to live a more sheltered life, to do priestly things. And then in a time of intense persecution, there were large encampments for protection, and you would come out there. One of the laws of the Essene order is that you always carried a weapon. short sword usually, but so if no one was foolish enough to attack an Essene encampment. Um, but they got along with the Romans well. If you went into a city, they didn't really need weapons there because Rome was there. But out in the country, you got to be careful. So it's interesting. It kind of makes me wonder when Jesus went out into the wilderness area and fed and talked to the 5,000, where was he at exactly? And was it major Essene people? Or we know there's Essenes and Pharisees and Romans and stuff there, but pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's cool to look at that. Like sometimes Jesus just walks into a town and all these people get converted, and then other times it's he says all this stuff and he can't seem to make headway, and it's like, well, that's because those ones that were easily accepting of him were most likely Essenes that knew the prophecies and knew what to look for. So it all fits together.
Mhm.
Lastly, you have the fragments of priestly laws, and there's some really interesting things in here concerning even stuff like gender fluidity and even prophecy. What can you tell us about these fragments?
Um, they're hard to figure out exactly, but one thing is really interesting is the words that they use. And it's the same words that Paul uses, but they half the time, and probably would completely if we had the whole thing, explain the definitions. So, for instance, to me, when I read the scriptures and it talks about you shouldn't hold a grudge, to me that means you made me mad and I'm just not going to talk to you. Well, that's not a grudge. A grudge is you need to be executed, and I don't want anybody to know I'm doing it, so I will wait a while, and then when we're in a dark alley somewhere, you will disappear. I'm holding the grudge for a time. It's a much more serious thing. And so it's interesting. And they talk about like the Sabbath starting, and they make it very clear the Sabbath starts on Friday night, the sixth day of the week, at sundown, and they mention it's when the widest part of the sun, which would be the diameter, is right on the horizon. And so they give descriptions on this exactly how to figure out the Sabbath and the rituals and things like that. So it's interesting to look at all those things. A lot of it is practical. A lot of it has to do with us. They had rules like, for instance, we don't lie to each other. We always respect each other, and no foul word comes out of our mouths. Period. And that's not between you and me. That's just between me and God. This is a very serious covenant that He's told us to do. And so it's really interesting to see all that.
Yeah, definitely. Next, we have the community rule. What is the community rule, and how does that compare with the Damascus document?
Community rule is more of the Damascus document is more of the history, what the Holy Spirit told them to do, more of the theology. The community rule is more of the specifics on how to do different things. But it's not just do's and don'ts. They have things in there like, for instance, when you enter a camp, there is a guy called the inspector. It's kind of like the head priest or whatever. But he would come to you and talk to you and realize that you have a musical talent or you have a prophetic talent or whatever. He would find out what your spiritual gift is. And he would set you over here in the corner with other people that have the same spiritual gifts that you do, and things like that. And he would make sure that people are following directions. He would be the counselor and different things like that. There's a whole lot of things like that. They had a series of herbal medicine guides. They were known to live to be 120 was their normal lifespan, whereas an average person lived to be about 60 back then. So they were known to be faith healers also. They would pray. So there's just a whole lot of very practical things in there. But the community rule, the Damascus covenant, and then 4Q um, instruction, I think are actually all pieces of the same thing because it sounds like it. It's that kind of instruction. Not so much on prophecy, although there's a good amount of prophecy in it.
That's really interesting. We also get a lot about human nature and spirit versus the flesh stuff in part one of the community rule. What does this document teach, and how does it compare with like our Christian beliefs?
Pretty much the same. I think it's First John. He talks about the spirit of truth versus the spirit of error. That's what it says in King James, and it actually is more spirit of truth versus the spirit of deceit. And they use the same exact phrases in there. They would talk about the spirit of truth versus the spirit of deceit being the fruit of the spirit versus the works of the flesh. But it's interesting that the phrases are always different. Paul says it's the fruit of the spirit. They would call it the foundation of the spirit. Rather than fruit, it's almost like the roots. I mean, you can't really grow unless you got the basic stuff down, is their kind of a concept. And again, the lists are almost identical with the same kind of things. So you can pull Peter, Paul, and James and John together, and the same basic concepts are taught, which makes most of us think that John was an Essene. We know John the Baptist was. And so it's really neat to see that all that together. The To me, it's amazing that the theology is the same. We would only want to use the New Testament as our rule and guide of faith, and we judge everything by the New Testament. But when you look at these things and they're so far 100% accurate, and the Pharisees are pretty much 100% wrong, it pretty much tells you what's going on back in the 400 silent years.
Yeah, for sure. Part two deals with a number of things, including how they accepted new members. Do we see this kind of thing in the Bible anywhere, potentially, maybe even with Paul?
A little bit, yeah. Paul, the membership concept is that they need to prove themselves. And I think one thing we do wrong is someone comes into our church and we have an altar call and they get saved. They say they're a Christian, and so we baptize them and make them part of the community. And I guess for safety in America right now, it doesn't matter. But in communist China, again, it's an example of a life versus death type situation. So you need to pretty much prove, and it'd be easy to do if you are a Christian. We just need to watch you for 6 months and see if you're serious. Everybody makes mistakes, but you'd be serious in that respect. And that's the entire concept I think that's given. One of the things that they did was you became part of, they watch you, and then if you say you're a Christian and you become part of the order and they baptize you into the order, then you have like a 1 year, like almost like a trial thing. You don't go in, you don't give your opinion, make decisions. You learn the ways that they do things, eat the food that they eat, live their lifestyle, and then if you still want to proceed, you can. It's like not everybody's supposed to be a deacon or a pastor, but if you're going that direction, you need to go through some training and you need to follow directions. I think it'd be a lot easier to follow directions when you knew somebody was a 100% accurate prophet as opposed to, somebody that doesn't know what they're doing. So it's really interesting to see that the idea of the prophecies being given. One of the things I thought was neat was as far as the gifts of the Spirit are concerned, anciently the Pharisees said the gifts of the Spirit had ceased. And the Sadducees said, no, we practice them every day. And you can kind of see, well, if you're a cult, I could see the Holy Spirit not working through you. But then you get to the first century, and evidently the Essenes were right because the gifts of the Spirit function in the first century. We see that through the book of Acts. But then you get to a certain place, and most Christian groups today would say, well, the gifts stopped working. Well, in some churches, they still work. So we're kind of in the same boat again. It's like maybe the Lord's doing something, maybe they didn't for a while. It's all up to Him. But if you consistently don't see the gifts of the Spirit and the Holy Spirit leading you, maybe there's something wrong and maybe that's something to investigate.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny in studying this myself, just the parallels that of the issues that they were dealing with at the time and what we're dealing with in our time. I mean, they mirror each other. And when you learn about the calendar and the prophetic cycles and stuff like that, it makes sense. So that kind of stuff's really interesting. It also talks about the establishment of Qumran, and this gets into the word Damascus, because we're not talking about Damascus in Syria here. So how does this document explain that, and what is the whole parallel Qumran Damascus, the whole naming? What's the whole story behind that?
Okay, well there's a Damascus, Syria, and it means something in Arabic, but that's a completely other subject. And Paul did go to Damascus, and that's where he was almost, executed, and they let him out of the side on a basket, and where he had his blinded experience in this. But Qumran was the area that they came back to after the establishment of a peace to prepare the way of the Messiah. And so that was their headquarters there for quite a while. But they named it New Damascus as to contrast with the old Damascus. And Damascus, if you break it up in Hebrew, can be Dam, meaning blood, like Adam is red blood, Dam meaning blood, and Maske, which is like an heir or the castle of an heir, that kind of stuff. So calling this New Damascus, we're saying that this is the house of the blood heir. So they're actually saying that we follow the true Messiah. We recognize the prophecies, and when he comes, he will be accepted here. And this is the proper way. There's actually a piece in the Damascus covenant that talks about, well, two things that are really interesting. One of them is that they talk about one of the reasons for writing the covenant to begin with is to welcome our brothers and sisters from the age of grace into the kingdom. And I just think that's so cool. Some guy 20 centuries ago knew about you and me being believers, and he wants to say, you're Gentiles, we know that, you're still okay, and you're brothers, welcome to the family. And it's just kind of neat to see that. But talking about Damascus and everything, that whole concept, there is a place in there where they talk about the time when the Messiah actually came and preached in Qumran, and a small incident occurred. So it's really interesting to see the histories of that stuff. This is what's supposed to happen. This is what we're expecting. This is what happened, and this is our reaction to it.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting. You have a section too on the priest and calendar rituals. What are the priest and calendar rituals?
Basically, the entire concept, much like we understand, most of us understand that Passover pictures the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. And the logical assumption would be on Passover of some year is when the Messiah would probably be put to death and resurrect, and in that area. But they talked about all the different festivals being pictures like that or prophetic. And one of the main things that they talked about, they actually have more prophetic dates than we do. There's the seven festivals mentioned in Leviticus, and there's actually two more that are major ones for them, new wine and new oil. And we don't have the rituals to those. Otherwise, I think we would understand it perfectly. If you just, because if you have this, the Passover Seder, I don't need to tell you anything. Just go watch the Passover Seder. It will click. So it's just really amazing, the death, burial, and resurrection. So one of the major things, though, is Pentecost for them. The whole concept is that on Pentecost, that's when God starts a covenant, and that's on a yearly basis. You go renew your covenant before the Lord. And then if and when he starts a new covenant, it'll be on a Pentecost. So they expected every Pentecost, everyone to come back and do the Pentecost ritual, which is kind of like rededicating yourselves to the law of Moses and to that time period. And they waited or talked about the fact when the age of grace come, there'd be a totally new ritual. The same with the Seder and stuff like that. But the idea of dedicating yourself, and when Messiah comes, you'll actually be able to, on a Pentecost, enter the age of grace. It's a different covenant. And they actually go forward and say, when the kingdom occurs, the age of grace will be over, and you will be able to, on a Pentecost, enter the kingdom age. It's a certain ritual that will exist at that time. And they talked about, they speculated on what it would be. But in their time period, they have, and it's in the Damascus Covenant, a good half of the ritual at least on what they do, how they rededicate themselves, how they promise to do, follow the law of Moses, doing the different things. Of course, they didn't expect Gentiles to do that or women to do that, but you could still enter a covenant because everybody has a covenant with God. So it's really neat to see that and to see that as a concept. Some of our Hebrew roots brothers get kind of confused and think we have to do the rituals the way the Jews did them. It's God's law, and if not, we're sinning. That gets back to that Pharisee idea. You're holding the fork wrong, so I need to kill you. That's what makes it a very, very spooky anything like that. You're a Baptist and I'm a Nazarene or whatever, therefore I need to like convert you one way or the other. That's just spooky, and that's where you get into that apostasy or the madness it talks about. But it's pretty neat to see those things, and I really wish we had more. I think if we ever do find the original rituals for all the festivals, it'll be very, very clear what all they point to.
Yeah, definitely. Next, we have 4Q instruction, which has a lot of advice about living a good life under God. What does 4Q instruction teach?
A lot of the same stuff. It talks about um, some of the practical aspect is like you don't go into debt. If you are in debt or have to for some reason, work night and day to get out of debt. It's pretty much a serious sin, much like anything else. Don't give yourself to alcohol or women, in an illegitimate way. Just different things like that. One of the things I thought it was neat is like you have a wife of your youth, your loved one, your one and only. And it talks about study the prophecies with her. It's really important that you're on the same page. And you're supposed to teach your kids. It's your responsibility to make sure they're taught. And I think a lot of times that's where we fall down, and especially the idea of when you get toward the end of an age, things get dark. The society gets evil. And so at that point, you can't really just send your kids off to school and think everything will be fine. You don't necessarily have to homeschool, but at least be on the school board, know what's going on, and if you need to, pull your kids out. That whole concept, it talks about how a lot of people in certain cities in Israel at the time that were getting pretty evil just simply picked up and moved to the country, planted their own gardens, lived out amongst other people that believed like they did. And the concepts were really clear. It's like if you stay in a city like that, like an inner city, your kids will grow up, they will fall in love with somebody, and that somebody will not be Christian, and now your grandkids are corrupted, and there's nothing you can do about it. So before that happens, make sure it doesn't happen. Very, very serious thing to do. And so the protection and everything, it's really interesting. The other thing that they talked about is the whole idea is that the food and the systems get bad. And so you need to do the proper herbal medicine to live a long life. And there's lots of examples of scenes in the New Testament. For instance, in Acts, it talks about, I think it's called Manin, but it's Menachem, who came and actually laid hands on the Apostle Paul. Well, it actually says there in Acts that this was the Menachem that was in Herod's court. Well, this would have been some 90 years before. He'd have to be at least 90 to 100 years old to be even there to put his hands on Paul. And you don't see too many 90-year-olds that just think, I'm in Antioch, I'll just hop on a donkey today and ride down to Jerusalem. And so it's interesting to see the herbal medicine aspect. And I've been trying to figure a lot of that out. There's a chapter in here about Haggai. There's not much about it, but they have an herbal medicine guide handed down from Noah to Shem through Enoch and then on down. And we're trying to backwards engineer some of these things. And we're getting close. I've improved my health quite a bit by following that stuff. But there's just a lot of practical knowledge. I mean, health, staying away from things that would influence you in the wrong way. And so many times today we say, well, I don't have time to take care of my kids. I don't have time to homeschool. I don't have time to do this. I don't have time to do that. Well, you have to make it happen somehow. Pick up and move somewhere where the school is a good school, or something. It's just you can't go to 40 hours of school per week and 1 hour of church and think that no matter how good it is, it's going to fix all the problems. And it just doesn't work that way. But there's a lot of practical. I love the business model, and then the whole idea of studying with your family the prophecies.
Yeah, that's so cool. And thinking about that, just it really does parallel our world today. I mean, our food is all messed up. Our schools are just abhorrent. Most of them, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so those parallels make a lot of prophetic sense. In fact, speaking of prophecy, there's also some prophecy in 4Q instruction. What does it say?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up, but there's actually quite a bit in there. Some of the stuff talks about making sure to study the birth times. I always thought that was pretty interesting. And birth times of what? Well, we're talking about the Messiah and the times when the ages change, and those kind of things. I think it all hinges back again to the calendar because some of the things they talk about is that a lot of there are like centuries that go by maybe and not even a single prophecy is fulfilled. But you get toward the end of an age, and there's a lot of little prophecies, a lot of things that happen. So, like for instance, right now we're waiting for prophecies to happen, but we've had a ton of them come since Israel's come back. Now that's been 80 years, but before then we had maybe one or two every couple of centuries, and then some 50 or better in the last 80 years. We've still got a ton of other prophecies, Psalm 83 and Damascus and Iran and things like that. Some of the things that's interesting here is that this tells us the Dead Sea Scroll version, which is what's going on right before the New Testament. And then we study the New Testament, which gives us the main details we're interested in. And then if we study the really early church fathers, we get to see what happened because of all of that. And you can see how the language is used the same and their concepts are the same. And it's neat, there's a church father, Hippolytus, that gives a list of those people that ran the school of the prophets, which includes John the Baptist. And talks about their schools and how things work. And it's interesting to see the names of the people and know that they wrote extra biblical books, and then to see some of the hints or the quotes, sometimes naming them, sometimes not, in the scroll. So it kind of helps you all pull it all together to see the before, the during, and the after the time of Christ.
What an exciting time to be alive that, we Gentiles in America 2,000 years later, like we have access to all of this stuff now. And
Amen.
it's super exciting. I love it. There's a lot of debate about the identity of the teacher of righteousness. What is the significance of this term in the Dead Sea Scrolls? And who do you believe the teacher of righteousness is?
They make it pretty clear the teacher of righteousness was to arise with healing in his wings. He is the one to whom we look forward to. He is the Melchizedekian priest. He is the one who is God incarnate. There's just tons and tons of talk about that. The problem is you've got people that um, don't want it to say what it says. And sometimes it's fairly easy just to change a couple of words around. For instance, I keep talking about how it constantly refers to the age of grace starting after Messiah's first coming. I had a guy on a radio interview one time said, I have all the Dead Sea Scrolls in English, but I have them all. Went through them all, and nowhere do they say anything about any age of grace. And yet you say it's all through there. Where are you getting this stuff? And I said, well, it probably depends on who's translating it. Age is an age or a kingdom. You and I know what grace is. It's an unmerited favor. So they're probably translating it kingdom of favor. So it doesn't sound Christian. And to my surprise, he said, oh, kingdom of favor. Oh, yeah, that's all through there. Oh, okay. So it's just like it all depends on how you translate it. So the teacher of righteousness, it's very clear. A lot of people say, well, that's probably the guy that started the group, whatever. But in three separate places, it talks about the teacher of righteousness was put to death by the liar, the evil priest. And that event was approximately, give or take, but approximately 40 years before the destruction of the temple. Now that has to be 70 AD or 536 BC, whatever temple we're talking about. So it's pretty obvious around 30, 32 AD, the teacher of righteousness was put to death because of a lying priest. And it goes on and talks about the fact that he is, the Messiah. So it's really straightforward. I mean, if it's the founder of the group, this guy's almost 400 years old. And that's not going to fly even by his seen lifespans. So we're obviously talking about the teacher of righteousness, the Messiah. There's two other places that talk about the teacher of righteousness, and they call him again, that's that translation. It's called the unique teacher of righteousness. Well, when you look it up, the word for it that's usually translated unique is Yahad, which is only one. So technically, this is the only begotten teacher of righteousness. All teachers are begotten, but this is the only begotten Son of God, in other words. So all the language is there, and it's pretty easy once you look at it from a messianic standpoint. But again, it depends on how you translate it. There's some regular Bibles, like New Testament Bibles, that are really, really bad. I ran into one a ways back. It was talking about how Mary, when the angel says you're going to give birth to the Messiah, and she says, how can this be? I've never known a man. This one Bible was so bad, it actually said, how can this be? My husband and I can't have kids. It's like that just completely obliterates the entire thing. but they talk about a virgin birth and stuff like that, so it's pretty straightforward.
Mm. Yeah, you have a section in there too called the Book of Time Divisions, and this topic's one of my favorite. Does this have any prophetic significance?
Yes, it's supposed to be all prophetic. Everything in Shemitahs and Jubilees. A Jubilee is a 50-year period, and that's broken up into 7 sets of 7. So a lot of times they don't bother with the exact year or the year and the day, but it was in that Shemitah, the second Shemitah of that Jubilee is when this happened. And supposedly it has a lot of that stuff. There are actually, I believe, 3 segments of it. One that talks about the kingdom, so we know that's yet future. One that talks about pre-flood, Nephilim problems, things like that. And then another one that just talks about the time of King David and a few things. So it's interesting to see that, and there's not a whole lot there of that, but it's neat to be told these things. So now we know there's a book of Haggai, the herbal medicine, which, when we get sick, that's really important. This prophecy book would be fantastic to have with all these dates in them. That would be cool. Some people have asked me, like 11Q13 actually gives us the date of 32 AD when the Messiah would come. Cool thing about that, they say, well, do you think that they just got that from the Holy Spirit? Or do you think they got it from Daniel chapter 9? Well, either way, it's the same. It's from the Holy Spirit. But it's kind of neat to see either one, they believe Daniel is Daniel. It's not made up by somebody in the Maccabean period. Really talked about 32 AD, and or they had confirmation through the Holy Spirit. So, or both. So it's really neat to see all that come together. So the prophecy aspect is really amazing. There's a whole lot of prophecies about things that happen right close to the second coming. Not a whole lot, but there's a good amount. One of my favorites, though, they talk about a time, it's called a visitation. And I think it's neat because remember when Jesus said, if you would have just known the time of your visitation, I could have gathered you like a hen gathers a chick. And so we look at that and we think, okay, visitation is just, when he came. We don't think about it as, no, that is a very specific term. It is a time when God moves on earth, period. And if everything's not right, you're toast. The visitation is something extremely serious. And you see that through the time periods. And so one of the things it talks about is at the end of each age, there is a visitation period where it's called a period of repentance, persecution. It's a time to let those people have a second chance and see through us the Messiah. Some of them will repent, but at the end of that time period, there's destruction for those that don't accept the Messiah. And it talked about the end of the first age is 120 years, and I remember 120 years to the flood, but 120 in Abraham's time. At the end of the beginning of the age of grace, right before the Messiah's first coming, it's supposed to be a 40-year period. And then before the kingdom age, with the Messiah's second coming, it's supposed to be a 7-year period. Now, again, did they get that from Daniel chapter 9, the 7-year tribulation? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe Holy Spirit told them. But there's just a whole ton of those kind of things in there. But again, no matter where they get them, they cooperate with the New and the Old Testament and just give us either the same thing we already know or more information. And it should be really, again, an amazing thing for our Jewish brothers and sisters to wake up and go, the Messiah did come to die for me 2,000 years ago, and I can still accept him. So,
That's amazing. Can you give us some background, just kind of how the Dead Sea Scroll calendar works? How what ages are, how their whole system of time works? Because I do have an announcement a little bit later about the Dead Sea Scroll calendar. But can you tell us how you kind of pieced all that together, what it all means, and people can even find this online because you made a website about it too.
yeah, our website is dsscalendar.org. Um, Basically, we're trying to compare everything to a regular Gregorian calendar we all know about. The Gregorian calendar is based on when Jesus was here. So if, and I say if, it's 100% accurate, it would have been, this is 2023, it would have been 2023 years ago this year that Jesus was born. Now that, may be off a year or two, whatever, but that's how it's dated. It's AD, Anno Domini. The old calendar is AM, it's from creation. And basically, what they taught is that there's 7,000 years of time, excuse me, between the creation of Adam and the new heavens and new earth. And the last 1,000 years will be a millennial reign of the Messiah ruling from Jerusalem. Same thing is taught in Revelation. But they break it up into ages. There's three sets of 2,000 years apiece. Each age is called, there's an age of chaos, an age of Torah, and an age of grace, and then a kingdom age of just 1,000. But the same time period is broken up into 14 onas, or 500-year periods. And each 500-year period is 10 jubilees. A jubilee is 50 years. Each jubilee is made up of 7 shmitas, or 7 7-year periods, and then a jubilee year. And so that's basically how the system works. So a lot of times they'll say it was in the, well, like 11Q13, that date is given. The date would be the first Shemitah. Actually, at the very end of the first Shemitah, after the end of the ninth Jubilee of the eighth Una. And that tells you perfectly exactly where you are in time. And so it's interesting to see that because they would date everything that way. And it seems to be very, very accurate. And so in the New Testament, when Jesus did something, or John or Moses did something in the Old Testament at this date, and then it says 5 days later something happened, you instantly know the date. You know the whether it's a Sabbath or not, how close it is to a festival. All of a sudden, things kind of fit. And they have the same language throughout the New Testament, and you're supposed to know these things. Like when Jesus went to the wedding of Cana, it said it was on the third. The third of what? Well, you know, the third. Wedding, Cana, third. You know what I'm talking about. And we don't because we don't know that calendar, but that's plenty to know exactly what's going on. And I bet you 10 to 1 he does something with wine at that feast of Cana, and sure enough he does. And so it's neat because they'll talk about how the world was created or the sun, moon, and stars rather were created on the fourth day of creation week. So we call that Wednesday. It's the fourth day of the week. So New Year's is on Wednesday, and they have a 364-day calendar instead of a 365. And so that means it's divisible by 7 days, 52 weeks even. So every New Year's is on a Wednesday. Every Passover is Tuesday. Everything's always the same, so you can always calculate. Like when Daniel says the 1335, it doesn't fit on a modern Jewish calendar, but on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, it's perfect. It's really easy to figure. So you can figure out those kind of things. So it's neat to see that consistently. And so the years are there, all that stuff. The one thing that confused us for the long time was we all know, no matter it's a 364 or 365-day calendar, there's something left over. So somewhere along the line we have to have a leap something, because on a calendar you have to have a full day. So it's just, yeah. So what was their leap system? And we have whole calendars in the Dead Sea Scrolls of 5 and 6 years before they start over. So that shows us, and then they have moon phases on some of those. So it shows us there's no leap day or two or whatever every single year. They don't do anything with leap months. And so at the end of every fifth or sixth year, that would be just enough space to do a leap week. And again, that would keep the Sabbaths in sync because Sabbaths are very, very important. And so we finally figured that out. I didn't. The guys at the University of Tel Aviv did that. And then finally we're able to pull it all together 3 or 4 years ago. And it's a very fascinating calendar, and it's very simple and seems to be very prophetic.
Yeah, definitely. When I was researching for my book, The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, I took that calendar and all the way from Genesis to Revelation it fits. And I mean, I've been obsessed with prophecy ever since I was a little kid. Like especially the book of Revelation. I just always loved it.
Mm.
But I could never make sense of the day counts and because they just don't fit on any other calendar. But it's like finally with this calendar, it fits beautifully and it answers a lot of questions. Like, for example. There's kind of a debate going if the two witnesses come in the first half or the second half of the tribulation. Well, with that calendar, you can piece it all together and show it has to be the first half, and especially when you attribute that somewhere in that time period, because it's 7 years, there's going to be a leap week, and I pieced that all together in the book and showed that, hey, I think this answers it. It would have to be in the first, which for a lot of other reasons makes more sense anyway. But yeah, the discovery of this calendar system, so far, like in my ministry, it's been the most exciting thing, and I just absolutely love it.
Can I say one other question about the calendar? I thought it was pretty neat as far as the prophecy goes. Sometimes you'll look at the AM calendar or BC, and it'll be so many days between this event and that one, and it doesn't appear to be anything. It's just kind of random. When you look at Shemitahs and Jubilees, though, all of a sudden you see all sorts of parallels because of the way it comes out. And someone pointed this out to me the other day. I thought it was interesting. The on just on the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, this last war when Israel started, it was October 7th, I think. It was that Saturday morning. Well, the Friday night, Saturday morning is a Sabbath. So it's the 17th of Tishrei is what it was. So anyway, we're looking at that and we're going through backing up, or the 17th of the month. So anyway, it was October 7th is what it was. But I went back and looked it up on the same calendar. The Yom Kippur War was actually on the same day. Now, it's not on the modern Jewish calendar and it's not on the Gregorian calendar, but it is on that one. And so I started looking it up. Is there anything else that happened on that day? Which again wouldn't exactly fit unless you're using that calendar. And it's the day that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. And you had to take a long time for the waters to recede. So what the ark has to do with a war, I don't know. Maybe that part is a coincidence, but it's interesting to see that. I don't think two wars, major wars like this, starting on the exact same day is a coincidence. But you'd never see that if you're looking at the Gregorian or the modern Jewish calendar.
It's so interesting. I didn't know. I actually I've been so busy I haven't compared that with the calendar. But that is that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that's more than a coincidence as well. You mentioned the book of Haggai. How much of that do we actually have? And do you think that there's other fragments out there, or there are other pieces that we might find sometime in the future?
I think so. The Damascus covenant itself was fairly intact, but there were some major holes in it. And there was a piece that was found at the Geniza in Egypt, and that was perfectly preserved. Of course, nobody looked at it because it would be dated Middle Ages, but so it's at least Middle Ages. So pulling all those together, there's things all around the planet where there's all these different scrolls. There's several thousand Hebrew scrolls down there in Egypt, and several other places that haven't even been cataloged yet. So who knows what's going to be there? And just because they're medieval, we got to remember the oldest copy of the Bible we had was medieval until, 11th century, until the Dead Sea Scrolls came along. So very, very important. But the Book of Haggai is the herbal medicine book. It's talked about a lot all the way through the scrolls. Very little, if any, is given to it except little references here and there. They'll mention, for instance, that they do intermittent fasting. They'll mention that they eat the Passover lamb, so they're not vegetarians. They'll mention that they drink the wine, so they're not, they do that, and different things like that. So we've able to figure out that they did a lot of fermentation, not necessarily alcohol, but fermenting the herbs to keep them. Like for instance, today, if you garlic is probably the one of the most potent antibiotics that doesn't have side effects. If you ferment it in honey, it gets even stronger. So just little things like that. You can do these home remedies, and a lot of it's been around for a while. But a lot of it hinges on anti-inflammatory foods. And some of the things that I've noticed, for instance, John lived a long, long life. He died according to church history, in the time of Trajan. So he had to have been well over 100 years old. And 100 to 120 is normal for an Essene. So, but that tells me one thing. The basic idea for a Christian is you go out to the Gentiles and you make disciples and you eat what's set before you and you don't ask questions, right? So if you're eating their food and they only live to be about 60 on their food, and you eat their food with them to be a brother, but somehow you still live to be 120, it's got to be supplements. Maybe it doesn't matter how many potatoes you eat, but you've got to have some other supplements with that. So the whole idea of it being fermented, the herbal medicine, the anti-inflammatory, things like that. I've been experimenting with several things to lower my blood pressure, and I probably am all stopped up for eating hamburgers all my life. So apparently I've gotten that fixed. As a side effect, the same herbs have completely wiped out my allergies. I used to be deathly allergic to walnuts. You give me a walnut, throat swells up. I probably have to go to the hospital. Now I accidentally eat one and don't even notice it. Matter of fact, as at the conference, I think you guys were going to be there, but Tom got sick. So at the Prophecy Watchers conference, we went in one of the dinners and they had German chocolate cake and lemon cake. Well, the German chocolate cake's got nuts in it, so I'm just going to grab the lemon cake and eat it. Who would ever put walnuts in lemon cake? Nobody does that. But they did, and I took a bite and it didn't bother me. And I thought, well, this has happened 2 or 3 times now. I'm just going to try it. I ate the whole cake. Well, the piece, just one piece. But didn't bother me. And so it's really interesting. It's apparently what happens is that you get a histamine reaction and then you swell, and then you get a bad histamine reaction and then it's dangerous. Well, if you can't swell, I still have the allergies, but if I can't swell, nothing happens. So it's some people have that kind of a thing and some don't, but it's just interesting to see. It depends on how healthy you are. I mean, if you have diabetes or other stuff, it's going to be harder, but they talked about how not being overweight is one thing, that being overweight shortens your lifespan. So there's all these different ideas, and then there's pieces of things that they have, and we're trying to kind of piece them all together. One thing that helped was that the one of the copies of this document, Haggai, would have been Shem's. Now, Shem's great 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 grandson was Shun, the Yellow Emperor, who produced the Chinese herb classic. So that has to be connected with it. And that helped us to go back and look at some of these things and kind of see how they fit. And they talk about earth dragons enzymes, for instance, and it's the same kind of stuff. So we're beginning to piece it back together, I think, and it's helping a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. My wife's a holistic health practitioner, and she's, I mean, even just with me, I mean, she's changed a lot of things in like my supplements and diet and stuff, and I've seen a lot of benefits of it too. It's really really powerful stuff. You know, God's given us all the medicine that we need. But well, we discussed a lot, but in reality, we have barely scratched the surface of the content in your book. What would you want most for people to take away from our conversation tonight?
Well, as far as this book goes and the Dead Sea Scrolls in general, they were healers. They were 100% accurate priests, prophets. The concept of prophecy and theology is identical with Christianity. There's one God who somehow manifests as three persons. The Messiah is God, but he's not the Father. He died for your sins almost 2,000 years ago, the date they have listed. Um, and according to the scrolls, no matter who has lied to you about this, you have the ability to accept Messiah. He still loves you and wants you to be saved, and you have the ability to accept him. And so many people are thinking about it, looking at the New Testament, seeing if it fits with the Old Testament, seeing what the scrolls say, and then basically accepting the Messiah, becoming messianic. And this is, I believe, the fulfillment of what Paul says eventually all Israel will be saved. And I think we're entering into that time period. I think there's a prophecy in Isaiah 29 that clearly predicts the discovery of the scrolls and some of the things that happen. So for us that are believers, prophecy is cool. The little more information that we have pulls a few things together, and we're beginning to really see some stuff now with what, especially with the war going on. But the fact that all these books and scrolls that are accurately predicting the future all say the same thing, that we're destined for hell, not our fault, but we're still destined for it, and there is a way out. The Messiah loves you and wants to fix it. And so I would encourage everybody to do that, to really seriously think about it.
Amen. Well, I really want people to pick up this book because it's absolutely phenomenal. Where can people get your book, and where can they follow you online?
I'm at BibleFacts.org. We do a Monday night live stream at 7 p.m. on YouTube, and then there's a few other things during the week. I have a bookstore on the website, BibleFacts.org. It's basically just links to Amazon. So you can go on Amazon and buy that stuff. So far I think I've written 34 books. And the last five or six I'll deal with Dead Sea Scrolls and that kind of stuff. And I just think it's fascinating to study. Again, pulling the church fathers, the New Testament, and the Dead Sea Scrolls together, it really completes the story.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I should mention, too, I said that I had a brief announcement that as soon as I have a chance, I will be creating the physical, the Dead Sea Scroll calendar for 2024. So for those that aren't familiar, Ken Johnson, like we mentioned earlier in this episode, has expertly put together the Dead Sea Scroll calendar on his website, dsscalendar.org. And for the past 2 years, this next one will be the third, I put those into print format, and Ken and I have been making those available to you through his website, BibleFacts.org, in the store, and my website, DailyRenegade.com. So very shortly, definitely before Christmas, because they make great gifts, I will update the calendars for 2024, and we will make those available in the same places on our websites. And I'll also make an announcement when they're ready. So make sure all of you out there watching, make sure you subscribe to us here and turn on all notifications so you'll be notified when we upload something new. Ken, thank you so much for joining us again on the Sharpening Report. This has been an just enlightening, absolutely phenomenal discussion, and this stuff is just so interesting. I love it. We'll definitely have to have you back on again sometime soon.
Well, thank you.
Anytime, anytime. And thank all of you for joining us. Until next time, love you all. Take care, and God bless. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Well, today we welcome back to the show our very good friend, Dr. Ken Johnson, who has authored numerous books and translations having to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient history, and prophecy. Today we're going to look at some prophecies from within these ancient texts that may shed some light on how close we are to the rapture and how close the world is to the tribulation. But first, if you are viewing on YouTube or Rumble, please subscribe. And on YouTube, click the bell for all notifications so you know when we post a new video, which has been fairly frequently lately. Also, if you want this full video here, head on over to dailyrenegade.com. The link is in the description, and get a membership today. I will get more into that later. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Ken Johnson back to the show. How are you doing, Ken?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for being able to do it on such short notice. I've been trying to schedule as many of these as I can before I move. The audience already knows. If people are viewing for the first time, I'm moving to go work at Prophecy Watchers, and I'll be there next week. So I've been trying to cram in as many interviews as I can before that. So really appreciate you taking the time for this.
Congratulations on going to Prophecy Watchers.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's going to be great. Well, let's jump right in. So one thing that people seem really interested in is Enoch's Apocalypse of Weeks. Can you give us some background on what this prophecy is, and what are some key points that stand out to you?
Well, it's a prophecy found in the book of Enoch, and basically he takes all of human history, the Essenes and almost everyone earlier, pre-flood, post-flood, up to the time of the Messiah, had a calendar, and they basically taught that there'd be 7,000 years of human history, 6,000 of human, and then like a 1,000-year millennial reign of the Messiah. Same thing that's taught in Revelation. And so we usually break it up in sets of ages of 2,000 years or millennia, like 6,000 years, which is what the symbol of the Sabbath basically taught, 6 working days and 1 day to rest. And so Enoch did a little bit different. Each day was a century. And so you have a week of centuries, so 700 years. So he would break it up into like the first 700 years, the second 700 years, and so on. But in each one of those, he talked about the temple being built, or the Messiah coming, or the kingdom age, or things like that. So they're very fascinating. They're very accurate, and just some really big prophecies for that 700-year time period.
excuse me, where are we in that prophecy, and how can we actually tell?
One of the things is in the last 700 years, it talks about a judgment and gives you some information that we're talking about a 1,000-year period. So that puts us the 300 years into the other or the previous day or week. And so what's interesting about it is it puts us into within the last couple of 100 years, the time for the beginning of the millennium. So there's several other books and several other scrolls that talk about that. So we're getting very, very close to the last Jubilee, the time when most of the prophecies would be fulfilled, and then the time of the second coming, which should start the kingdom age.
Yeah, which is really exciting. And when I looked into it, I was blown away to find out. I believe that we're right in the middle of the ninth week in that prophecy. And when you do the timing, the middle of the ninth week is 2025. Well, between 2025 2026, somewhere around there. But so we're like right on the doorsteps of that, which is really amazing. There's a couple of more obscure prophecies that you found, and I believe it was in the Apocalypse of Ezra, but correct me if I'm wrong, having something to do with our food and a problem with our memories in the end times. Can you explain that whole prophecy and how that probably connects with our time today?
Yeah, it's in the Ezra Apocalypse, but it's actually in some scrolls and several other places, probably 5 or 6 different places. It's just one of the prophecies of the end times. There's atmospheric things, there's wars, there's earthquakes, there's all sorts of different kinds of prophecies. But one of them is that we begin to develop problems with our health because of the kind of food we're eating and or what we're breathing or toxins of some sort. The basic teaching is that if you eat the proper herbs and you eat a proper diet and get plenty of exercise, which that was easy back then, that you basically can live to be 120. And most of the scrolls and even Josephus and other people from the first century said that the average Gentile lived to be about 60. The average Pharisee maybe 70 or so. The average Essene lived to be 120, just like they did back in Abraham's time or shortly thereafter. And so this whole idea of eating proper herbs and that kind of stuff. So then there's a set of prophecies that talk about it gets bad at the end times. So each church, for instance, or group of people is supposed to have a pastor who has a heart for the Lord, a prophecy expert, and an herbal medicine expert. If you don't have those 3 people in leadership, you don't really have a church. So I just thought that was interesting the way they talk about it. But some of the things are we developed this odd form of forgetfulness. And of course, everybody gets a little, I'm doing the same thing. I'm in my 50s, almost 60, but I will forget stuff. I'll stop for a minute and think, wait a minute, but Josh Peck, that's his name. I'll do this kind of stuff. But I remember what I'm talking about. It just takes a second to come. And then, but with stuff like Alzheimer's, once it's gone, it's gone. I don't know who you are, and I never will remember who you are. Those memories are actually gone. So it talks about that kind of thing. And it says it's because of the evil of our generation, which to me means greed. And we have things like excitotoxins that are put in the food that make you think you like the food better so that you buy some more, eat more. And that's wonderful for the pocketbook. If I'm selling you something, you'll get more of my stuff. But it kind of reminds you of the drug dealer that gives you a free sample to get you hooked and then charges you, and then you'll steal, kill, do anything to get it. So it's kind of a legalized form of that, I guess. And so no specifics in exactly what it is, but it's about because of the evil of the age, we have problems with food, we have problems with other things, and there is an unnatural forgetfulness, and there is unnatural anxiety, and several other things like that. The scrolls talk about the whole idea of going back to agriculture, growing your own herbs, things like that, to continue to live a good lifespan. So it's fascinating to look at that. It even talks about aging process begins to get worse. So if you think about it, pre-flood, we had lived to be 700 to 800, 900 years old. Post-flood, we lived to be about 4. And then about 4 to 5 generations into it, something else happened. And then we began to live 200. And it kind of trickled down. But The 120 is just kind of standard for us now, or should be. And there's actually about 6 or 7 different uh, ethnic groups around the globe that still live to be 120 because of how they eat and what they do. So it's fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah, it's amazing how that was predicted so long ago. I don't know if I'm remembering this right. This is just off my memory, which it's fading too. So, but wasn't there? It might have been in a different place or a totally different book, but I thought it might have been in the Ezra Apocalypse. Wasn't there something about like babies will start speaking like earlier than normal or something
Yeah,
like
there's
that?
several
Does that?
several of those. I think one of them might be in the Ezra Apocalypse too. That's part of the aging process. It said that the
Hmm.
babies would start speaking before 1 year old. That doesn't necessarily mean carrying on a college age conversation, but and I'm not sure where we're at now. Some of the stuff was babies would be born at 4 months and live. It used to be
Hmm.
that a 7 month premature baby at 7 months probably won't live, and now it's like, oh, that's a done deal unless there's something weird. It depends on what caused the spontaneous abortion. But 6 months, and then there's been a few at 5, but that's really cutting it close. But our technology keeps going. But it talks about babies being born, speaking about 1 year or so. It talks about people like most of us gray at 40 or 50, or maybe 60 if you're lucky. I grayed early in my 40s. But it talks about people graying in their 20s, and so the whole concept of the lifespan and gestation periods, the whole thing goes down. So you can figure this if you look at the post pre-flood world, they started having kids at 130 years old, and they lived to be about
Hmm.
900. Today, you could probably father or give birth successfully at 13, and we live to be 90. So it's basically the same ratio, just kind of ran down. And so apparently that happens again. So the whole idea to me, though, I thought is interesting about that is that if you have something like that happen, the idea of it taking generation after generation, going down a year and then a year and then a year, means the Lord's not coming back for a few hundred years. And I don't believe that. I think the Lord's coming back pretty quick. So that makes it sound like, in addition to food and toxins kind of giving us diseases, somebody tries to do something, maybe through some sort of genetic manipulation to fix a disease or something, and it causes a backwards aging or something like that. It's just kind of,
Yeah.
it doesn't say, but for something like that to happen and it be completely fulfilled in, say, like a 7 year period or in the next 5 years or something, that would be pretty, it'd have to be something like that. So we need to very carefully watch our medicine. And that's what the scrolls talked about a lot of times, the whole idea of the book of Haggai, to have herbs that fix your problems or keep you healthy. And they believed in the Nephilim. So the whole idea of genetic experiments causing the uh, mixtures of species, but also some of them didn't work out so well. So there's always problems. And the concept was that somehow toward the end of our age, they begin to bring back what they call Nephilim medicine. So things dealing with genetics. I'm not saying if they have a genetic cure that's going to fix your lungs or let you see again or whatever, that you shouldn't do it. But that's the crossroads where you have to start looking very careful at what we're doing.
Yeah, wow, that's a good way to describe it. Nephilim medicine, and we're seeing a lot of advancements in technology, genetics. I mean, it's getting really bad, and I wonder if it's this bad now when we actually have Christians on the earth and the Holy Spirit is in Christians. Imagine after the rapture how much worse it's going to get. The greed and the corruption, and how much worse. And speaking of that, there's something that you brought up before about the rapture and this idea of shining, or the shining ones that show up in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the book of Daniel. Can you explain that? And where do these references show up? Who are these shining ones, and what does that have to do with the rapture?
Well, remember the Lord at the Mount of Transfiguration. He was walking along, and all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah showed up, and they were all transformed and kind of in glowing form or glorified form. And then after that event, everything was kind of normal. So we get an idea the glorified form actually gives off light. And you see that in a couple of other places. The scrolls talk about a time when the Messiah was in Qumran and the Pharisees came down to arrest him, but it wasn't yet his time. And it simply says he manifested and they left. So you have the same kind of thing when they go to arrest him and he says, I am, and they all fall back. So there's some really interesting things about that. But in Daniel 12, that's one of the things that I think is probably the easiest scripture to see a pre-trib rapture. And because the whole concept is it talks about there's a time where there's a resurrection and then there are shining ones. So Paul tells us the resurrection and the rapture happens at the same time in the twinkling of an eye. And so whenever this happens, there are people in their glorified bodies. And then it talks about the righteous at that point shine like the stars. And some of that is idiomatic, but it actually has a reference to the glorified form. And then it talks about from the time of the resurrection, which also includes the rapture, 3.5 years later is the abomination desolation and the starting of the persecution. And then it says the persecution lasts not 1,260, but 1,290 days. And so I'm not sure exactly how they overlap, but it shows us that it's two separate time periods. There's a 1,260 and then there's a 1,290. And they kind of go back to back or overlap a little bit. But if you have a rapture resurrection and basically 3.5 years to a abomination and basically 3.5 years more or less to when everything is fixed, that's a pre-trib rapture. So it's fascinating just to kind of see that. And most of us, we go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and Paul explains it very well then. But a lot of people that are not pre-trib have come up with ideas on why the revealing of the Antichrist is really this or really that. And if you plug in Daniel 12, it's pretty much a done deal.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you and I are both pre-trib rapture believers, and we actually have a viewer question relating to this, and we'll get more into viewer questions a bit later. But since this one is so similar to my question, I wanted to bring it up here. So I'll read hers and then I'll read mine after. But Shanna wrote, he has addressed it in detail on more than one occasion before, but maybe he can touch on his studies of the pre-trib beliefs of ancient writers alive long before the, quote, Darby invented it nonsense that cycles around repeatedly. And so that's her question. My question, which is very similar, is do you believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls and possibly other ancient texts, such as from the ancient church fathers, teach pre-trib rapture? And if so, what would be the best few examples that you could bring up?
Actually, yeah, there's quite a few. The problem, I think, comes from being in a denomination that believes a certain way. And then if you find evidence the contrary, you just say, well, that has to be symbolic or whatever. Because if it is, I've got to change my way of thinking. I've actually had people tell me that because the whole idea of Israel coming back, fulfilling prophecies, they say, well, it's not possible because we're Israel. Okay, and I understand that kind of theology. And that actually makes a little bit of sense, at least up until 1948. But when I point out the fact that they were supposed to come back and they did, and not only that, they were supposed to come back on a specific date and they did. So how do you wrap your head around that? And I was actually told by one guy, it's like, well, we don't know, but it just flat has to be a coincidence because otherwise our denomination is wrong and we are not going there. And it's just like, okay, that's almost fair Sadducee talk. That's hinging on blasphemy there. So when Messiah comes and he's not exactly who you thought he was, and you thought your denomination was correct and it's not, change denominations. You just follow Messiah. None of us are correct 100%, but whatever Messiah says when he comes, just do it. But the same kind of thing happens with this idea. It's like, well, Darby made it very, very popular. And before that, it wasn't known very well. But you've got to remember, in the Middle Ages, almost everyone was Catholic, okay? A Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. And there's always been people that have believed differently. But the vast majority, at least of books that we have and things, all taught Catholic doctrine. And so that's like saying, well, in the Middle Ages, everybody prayed to Mary, so we should pray to Mary. Well, no, I'm not Catholic. And there were people before the Catholics, in the first century that made comments like, Mary's not a goddess. We don't pray to dead people. It's a horrible sin, this kind of a thing. And they might be right and they might be wrong, but that's what they said. And it's the same thing with that. You've got several references in the Ezra apocalypse about a group of people that are taken away before the destruction comes. And if you are here, and if you manage to survive that tribulation period, at the end of it, you'll see that group of people come back. You know, and there's a lot of things like that. Even in the book of Enoch, it talks about a group of people that come and go and come back. And a lot of people talk about, well, why are we so special? We would get out of tribulation. And we're not special. And we happen to benefit from God's plan. The whole concept, according to the book of Enoch, is that it's to engender repentance. So the whole idea that everybody knows this wacky rapture idea, which is ridiculous, and then all of a sudden millions of people disappear, they're going to say, okay, it's not so ridiculous. It's the last ditch effort for help you to understand the prophecies are real so that you can possibly get saved. And that's basically what the scrolls are talking about. But you've got Irenaeus and Hippolytus. You've got the Epistle of Barnabas. You've got several people that talk about that. There's even a reference to a pretty clear reference, actually I say 3 clear references to a pre-trib rapture in the Didache. And there's other first century testaments. And then there's a few other things like that real early on. But even in the Middle Ages, like 15, 16, and 1700s before Darby, there are a lot of people that talked about, if we're reading this right, Israel has to come back. And then there's a time of what they called a catching away or a rapt, R-I-P-T. They use different terms. It's whatever language they were from, but the concept of some sort of a harpazo, taking away. So yeah, you can debate whether there's a pre-trib rapture, but you can't debate that it was taught before. I mean, that's like me saying I think the King James Bible was invented in the 1950s. Well, we all have grandfathers and grandmothers that have had King James Bibles. It's got to go back at least at least 100 years. You know, so you can't say that kind of stuff. There's too much evidence.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's really telling when you see people online that are just flat out against the pre-trib rapture. They think it's like a doctrine of demons and all this stuff. And they'll use the most extreme language that they can. And usually, you know, when you see most pre-trib rapture believers, and you know, nobody's perfect. You're going to get it on all sides, but from at least the people that I've interviewed and talked to about it, and the way that I try to be is, you know, we just don't fight about it, and we just talk about it, you know, like we're talking about. But yeah, some people get like really, really upset, and usually I find when emotion starts getting into it, when somebody has to passionately, you know, and angrily spout their opinion. A lot of times it's because there's not as much fact to back it up, so they have to supplement it with emotion, which kind of tells me that's probably not that's probably a sign that maybe at least this person doesn't have as much information as they think that they do.
There's actually an early church father that predicted signs of the end, you know, like earthquakes and stuff, pulling from scriptures. One of the unique things that he mentioned is that there would be much contention about his coming. That's really all they said. But now that we're in this time period, we can see that. Because if I was to say, I thought the Magog War was at the end of the tribulation, or it was before, it was 30 years before, you'd say probably, I don't see it that way, but whatever. And we could argue, mention stuff like that all day long, and neither one of us would get upset. But when you say pre-trib, it's all of a sudden we're ready to fight. And I just thought that was fascinating that the early church father, his name was Isaiah, said the same thing.
Wow. Yeah, that really is. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Well, we're definitely seeing that today. You put together a phenomenal book called Gad the Seer, and many people might not have heard that name before. Who was Gad the Seer, and what did he prophesy, and how might that connect with events that we're seeing play out today?
Well, it's fascinating because in the Bible, back in Chronicles, Kings and Chronicles, we're told during the days of Samuel, with Saul, David, and Solomon in that particular era, there were 5 prophets that wrote books of prophecy. There was Gad, Nathan, Ahijah, Shemaiah, and Iddo. And for whatever reason, they were not put in the canon, but there was a group of Jews that did keep those records. and they've come out in other places too. So I was able to get the text of Gad the seer and part of Nathan, and I'm still working on trying to get some of the others, but they're just ancient prophets from around 1000 BC, and very, very fascinating. Gad prophesies what I believe to be very clearly a pre-trib rapture, among other things, in chapter 14. But some of the fascinating things is he begins to identify, we're always looking for that Babylonian mystery religion in Revelation, which is described as a harlot. It's Babylon. It's, this kind of stuff. And there's enough things in scriptures to kind of connect them, but you still aren't never quite sure. And so Gad comes out and says, basically, there will be two anti-Semitic powerful religions. And he describes them, one from headquartered south of where Israel's at, and their symbol is a crescent moon. Okay, so I think I know who that is. And the other one is a group of people led by one guy who actually is Trinitarian, not completely monotheistic. Remember, back in the ancient days, everybody knew God, or the prophets did, and they were Trinitarian, but according to the scrolls. But this group, even though they seem good, they're headquartered in Rome, Italy. And of course, back in that day, there wasn't much of anything in Rome, Italy, and nothing in Saudi Arabia, basically. But these two become very powerful anti-Semitic religious powers. But they're not the problem. Somewhere toward, they probably fight amongst themselves, as far as we know. But somewhere toward the end of time, either they or factions from those two groups form this other religion, and it becomes the dominant, what they call the harlot religion. That's what Gad teaches. So today we would say that's some sort of Chrislam or some sort of combination type thing. Not sure exactly how it manifests, but to have these scrolls talk about those things, and like the Dead Sea Scroll Testament of Noah giving us more information about the empires and how they come together, it's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, especially since we've been seeing the the rise of Chrislam and Christians that so-called Christians that believe that Christianity and Islam worship the same God, which when you actually look at the text, it couldn't be more different. But we've been seeing that kind of rise up for a couple of decades now. It's not super huge, but it's growing, and I can definitely see how something like that would be could explode in the end days. One topic that people really love is the ancient Dead Sea Scroll calendar, and we've done a ton of interviews about that. But for those who might not be familiar, for those new to the channel, we've been getting actually a lot of more new people viewing the channel, which is great. Could you go through just kind of how this calendar works, how the Essenes would have used it, how it applies to the Bible, and what we can learn from it prophetically?
Sure. It's fascinating because it's not prophetic in and of itself. But the calendar is amazing. Most of us know about a Jewish calendar. There's Nisan and Tishrei and the 12 months of the year, and comparing it to our 12 months on our Gregorian calendar. Ours is solar. The modern Jewish calendar is lunar. This one is solar. So according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I guess there's no way to really prove or disprove this, but it's their calendar and their explanation, is that God gave the original calendar. It clearly shows the Sabbaths and the festivals of the year. It shows the years, the Shemitahs, the Jubilees, and the centuries, Onas, and ages. And so there are several things that they plug into. Like, for instance, one of the scrolls talks about Messiah dying for our sins. And that event is one Shemitah after the ninth Jubilee of their Ona, which they were in Ona 8. And so when you plug that into the Gregorian calendar, it means the Messiah is supposed to die in 32 AD, which fits perfectly with what as Christians believe. And so there's several other things like that, and the prophecies kind of connect all those dots. So we know exactly where we are on the calendar line. So again, we're all looking for that year 6000, and that last Jubilee period before is when a lot of prophecy occurs, a lot of the rapture, the tribulation, the second coming, Antichrist, all that's in there somewhere. And not necessarily at the beginning or at the end, but somewhere in there. And we're approaching that really quickly. March, which is, actually next Tuesday from the time we're doing this, is the Essene, on the Essene calendar, the new year. So that begins the Shemitah year, the last one of this Jubilee or this generation. Then we have a Jubilee year. Then we start the very last 50-year period, which is called the last generation. So that's really interesting for a lot of Bible prophecy people. But it basically does that. It works out that way. And the interesting thing about it, we all believe that there's no filler in Scripture. So when it says Jesus did something and then 5 days later something happened, you're supposed to know exactly what we're talking about. And most of us would say we'd have to grab a calendar and try to figure out the year and then the date. And, you know, and the way the calendar works, it's very simple and very easy. If I was to ask you what day was New Year's on, you'd say, well, it was the 1st of January, but it's different every year. It might have been Wednesday or Thursday or who knows. We'd have to get a calendar and look. Well, the calendar always happens on the Wednesday closest to the spring equinox. So that's always New Year's. So Passover is always on Tuesday, the 14th, you know, and on down like this. So when it says that, you know, Jesus had the Passover Seder, 3 days and 3 nights later, he resurrected, you don't even really have to look at the calendar. You can just do it in your head. And so all these things instantly come out. Like, for instance, John 2, when he goes to the wedding of Cana, it says that it was on the 3rd day. And we're like, 3rd day of what? 3rd day of the week? What are we talking about? I have no clue. Well, if you knew the calendar, you know exactly what they're talking about. A lot of weddings, like we have June weddings, everybody wants a June wedding. For several reasons, a lot of people had their wedding on the festival of new wine. And that is the 3rd of Av is when that takes place. So he's in there for a wedding in Cana on the 3rd, obviously the 3rd of Av, festival of new wine. And he arranges this to turn water into wine. So if we knew more about that festival, it would probably make a lot more sense to us what's going on. But just things like that. Moses did something, 5 days later something happened. You know if it was a Sabbath, what day of the week, what closest festival it was, the date even a lot of times. And you just know a lot of stuff. And that helps you figure out a lot of prophecy.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I mean, because of that calendar, we know that we definitely live in some really interesting times. I mean, like you said, the final Jubilee is set to start in like a year from now or something. And for people out there that are worried, thinking like, oh my gosh, I have to wait till 2075 before Jesus returns. We need to remember there is a rapture that happens before, and we don't know when that happens. The rapture isn't the thing that kicks off the tribulation period. It's the confirmation of the covenant with many. So you could have a rapture pretty early, and it could be years or even possibly decades between that and the start of the tribulation. Or if it is around the same time, we don't know how long after the tribulation, when Jesus comes back and takes care of everything. We don't know how long those judgments take. We don't know how long it takes to figure out what they're going to do with the temple, whether they're going to cleanse it or just rebuild it. I mean, we read in Ezekiel, there's this amazing city and temple. That's probably going to take some time to build. I don't think Jesus is just going to snap his fingers and it's all just going to appear immediately. He could do it like that, but I think that's actually going to be built. That could take some time. So you could have an early rapture and tribulation and still have some time before actually the official start of that millennium. And you know, when we look at the way that the Torah age ended, technically that would have ended around 75 AD. Now we would say the church age started 32 AD with the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. So there is kind of an overlap to some of these events and how it could all play out. So I just don't want anybody, if somebody's viewing this for the first time, don't worry. Nobody's saying that we're absolutely going to have to wait till 2075 for something to happen. Could be, but we don't necessarily have to believe that would be the case. It certainly didn't happen like that at the end of the Torah age. Stuff, prophecies started getting fulfilled pretty early. Oh, and I should mention, because of the calendar, Ken and I have available a print version of the Dead Sea Scroll calendar that has not only the ancient calendar that the Essenes would have used, but also our normal calendar that we use today. So you can look to any day and see if there's anything significant, like a feast day or anything like that. I have a link to it in the description below, or you can go to dailyrenegade.com and find it there, or you can go to Ken's website at biblefacts.org. And all of the proceeds for those are split between Ken and I, and it really does help both of our ministries continue so we can keep bringing you content like this. I wanted to make mention of that. There's also an online version too at dsscalendar.org. Before we get to the members only section, in your opinion, what are some of the most exciting and prominent prophecies that you found in your research? And I know we can't set dates, but how close do you believe that we might be to the rapture and tribulation?
Well, kind of like what you were saying, the rapture could be at any time. I think it is closer to the beginning of the tribulation than, like a really large gap or something. That being said, I've often thought that 2075 either is the second coming or the dedication of the temple. And if we have to build the Lord could do whatever, but it just seems like he's going to have us build it, or it comes in pieces or whatever. So that may take 10, 20, 30 years or so. So it is interesting that the scrolls prophesied a 40-year gap between the death of the Messiah and the end of the age. And they prophesy a 7-year gap at the end of our age, where there's this Gentile king who's claiming to be God incarnate, Son of God, the Messiah. And it's really, really fascinating, all those things, how they look at Daniel. And I think we're getting really close to that end of that age. I really thought that we wouldn't see any kind of prophecy at all until we get in that last 50-year period. But apparently I was wrong, because last year the Hamas war started, and Israel is very intent to actually finish the problem. If they do, that will actually fulfill Obadiah, Zephaniah, and a few of the other prophecies, because they eliminate Hamas. And that's one thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls taught, is that the Psalms teach prophecy. And one of the ways that you understand prophecy is that a psalm or a passage of scripture is written about as a song, and it's played on a certain musical instrument. And if a certain musical instrument has, 4 strings or 10 strings or whatever, that tells you the una that it's supposed to be in, if it's a prophetic psalm. And so we have things about the 12th una, which is our age, about prophecies like out of Amos 6 about a government seat or structure in Gath of the Philistines named Violence. Well, when you put that in English, you're talking about a government structure of the Gaza Strip who calls themselves Hamas. And they cause a problem with Israel and eventually are eradicated. And in the process of doing this, Israel takes and holds southern Lebanon. It tells us where the new border is going to be at. And then they colonize the Negev. And then there's a whole bunch of other things. We've got the destruction of Damascus. We've got a war between Israel and Iran. And that's actually mentioned in the book of Enoch also, which has got some very interesting details in Enoch that Scripture doesn't have. And then there's, like I say, the colonizing of the Negev. The Benjamite tribe is found and migrates home. There's several other prophecies like that we might get to see, because those may happen, especially if like Benjamites come home and then they're the ones that colonize and it takes 5 or 10 years or whatever. Then we might begin to see some of that stuff immediately or after this war. So it's really fascinating. We've got the Gog and Magog war involving Russia. We've got the formation of the 10 kingdoms, which we may or may not see, but it's interesting to look for. So there's quite a bit of Bible prophecy to look at, and the scrolls give us several more clues with all that. As far as studying prophecy, what we've always said is basically memorize Daniel. Daniel is like the best ever as far as prophecy. Daniel and then Revelation, but Revelation is really symbolic, hard to understand. But those two, and then there's the Ezra Apocalypse, the Book of Gad, the Seer. The Testament of Noah is amazing for setting the chronology parts together. And then there's whatever the Dead Sea Scrolls say about prophecy in general, and then the early church fathers, because they will come around and say, well, we've always been told by the apostles and everybody, this is how you interpret it. And it's basically the same. I'm just excited to see the scrolls and the church fathers interpret the Bible the same way we always have. And it's just very logical. But to know that's the way it was been given is pretty amazing.
Absolutely. And many of those books that you mentioned, you have available online. For those who might not be familiar with Dr. Ken Johnson, he actually has English translations that he's done himself of many of these books. Where can people get your books and follow you online?
BibleFacts.org is our main website. And then you mentioned the DSScalendar.org for the calendar stuff. Excuse me. But we have a YouTube broadcast with a live Q&A every Monday night. Currently, we've been studying the book of Enoch. We started at the first of the year, and we're going through that now. But we have that, and then we have the bookstore there on the website. They're basically just links to Amazon, so you know your credit card is safe and all that. But we have 34 books, I believe. I'm working on my next one, my number 35. Hopefully, I'll have that done for the Prophecy Watchers Conference this spring, or this summer, rather.
Oh, awesome. What's that one about?
Smaller Dead Sea Scrolls that contain prophecy. So there's actually a lot of their commentaries on the minor prophets and a lot of little scrolls that talk a lot about mainly first coming prophecies, but there's quite a bit of second coming prophecies in there too. And they're really amazing. I remember I always read Nahum. And I always thought to myself, why am I reading Nahum? It's just straightforward that. It has nothing to do with me, but it's like, no, it has something to do with you or it wouldn't be in the Bible. You read the Dead Sea Scroll commentary and boy, was I wrong. There's actually quite a bit in there. And then we have almost the entire Habakkuk commentary, which is very eye-opening.
Oh, fantastic. Whenever that comes out, we'll have to have you back on to talk about it. That sounds great. As we conclude the free section here, what do you want most for the audience to take away from the interview so far?
Just that we need to study, and it's not hard. We don't need to try to kill ourselves doing it, but study, come to a conclusion, build on what you're doing, understand that there are cults out there that twist things. But if the scrolls that are pre-New Testament and the New Testament, and then the early church fathers that are post-New Testament all say the same thing, that's probably true. And then later on in the medieval church, if we get this, there is no pre-trib rapture, you need to worship angels or whatever happens, the Kabbalah and other stuff like that comes along later, you can ignore those. And so to understand we're in that time period, we're going to be here a little while longer. It's not going to end in the next 10 seconds. But at the same time, it's going to happen in the near future. And even at that point, we don't know how long we're going to live. You could have a heart attack at any moment. So we really need to get our lives right with the Lord. And that's not hard to do either. It's just something that needs to be done. You need to recognize that you are a sinner. I am too. We all have problems. Nobody's perfect. But the Lord came and fixed that for us. So if we accept him as our Savior, we can have a free gift of eternal life. That's the major point. And I think that's the whole reason for prophecy, because there's no way you or I could tell the future and make it happen, but somebody did. And if they can do that, and they say, I can give you eternal life if you just simply do this, I think that's a pretty safe bet too.
I totally agree. Amen. All right. Well, we are going to head into the members only section. And if you're viewing at home, you will not want to miss it because we have some phenomenal viewer questions about Enoch, Nephilim, and so much more. So to get the full video, head on over to dailyrenegade.com and get a membership. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year. And if you can, I highly suggest getting the $100 a year because it's technically cheaper in the long run. Essentially, you get 2 months for free. So go get a membership today, watch the full video, join in on our community at Daily Renegade social media page on the website, dailyrenegade.com. It's for members only. And there you can make your own profile. You can post. You can comment on others' posts. It's a great way to fellowship it's a way that the church is desperately missing today. So head on over to dailyrenegade.com, get a membership today. Okay, if you are viewing on the website, just hold on the line. You don't have to do anything, and we'll get right back to it. Everyone else viewing for free on YouTube or Rumble, thank you so much, and until next time, take care and God bless. Okay, members only. Thank you all so much for supporting what we do at Daily Renegade. Let's get right back into it. We have some viewer questions that were brought in, and a lot of these are really good. One thing that a lot of people have been wondering, and I've wondered myself too, is Sharon asks, where did the flood? Where did the giants come from after the flood? What's your opinion on that? You got some really good information on this.
Yeah, there's actually several records about that. We're on our study on Enoch. We just finished up the pre-flood Nephilim history, so we've got to figure out how they ended the civil wars and what happened to them. And so that's the next logical question. Well, what happened afterwards? And we don't know for sure. I mean, there could be multiple things that happen. People talk about genetics coming through, which doesn't make sense. In other words, one of the daughters or one of the wives of the three sons may have had some Nephilim DNA or whatever. That's a possibility, I suppose, but nothing says that. And we can speculate all day long with stuff, but I tend to want to stick just with the scrolls and church fathers, whatever is written. Like Paul said in Corinthians about nothing beyond that which is written. It really helps to curb the speculation. But we have a couple of scrolls that talk about it. We understand that, for instance, pre-flood, there is genetic tampering. We have one scroll called the Book of Giants that tells you actually how to go about starting that kind of study of mixing species. So, and it's a genetic type thing that they do. So it's accurate. So what happens is after the flood, we have Canaan, who goes up and builds Zidon. First thing, he goes out of the allotted territory into Shem's territory. And it's a big deal, and we don't really know why. It's connected with Noah's dream that he has in Genesis, but he explains it completely in his testament. And so we know what's going on there. He's after the old forbidden knowledge. And so if you go up to Zidon where he made the port, that's about the closest place on the coast that you can get to make a pilgrimage kind of straight over to Mount Hermon. So the text talks about him finding documents, the writings of the Watchers, and beginning to emulate this stuff or put it back into practice. Well, the next thing you know, there's giants in the land of Canaan. And so not just giant people, but there's giant grapes, giant, everything. They've figured out how to make everything work better, kind of. And so that's basically at least one of the things that we know for sure, according to the scrolls, that happened, is that we just simply found the Nephilim medicine, so to speak, and tried to recreate it. And that's what's fascinating to me, because now we have people, some of the scrolls talking about toward the end of the age of grace, Nephilim medicine comes back, which means some sort of genetic something. And we have all these things. People are trying to make pig hearts, which are very similar to humans, better for transplants and lungs. And we've got cows now that produce human antibodies. And there's all sorts of things like that. One of the most fascinating to me was when they first started this, they took the gene of a jellyfish that makes you glow. We talked a little bit about the glowing. It's part of our DNA, I think, that's been curbed because of sin. But they managed to take the DNA from a jellyfish and put it into mice and cats and dogs and things like that. And they tried it on a gibbon monkey, and at first they couldn't get it to work, but eventually they did. So not a big deal, I guess, although in the wild, I think that would go extinct, the ones that glow, But that kind of stuff happened. It's not a joke. I know there's a lot of weird stuff on the internet, but that's not a joke. That's documented. And so we continue to do like testing and things like that. And this is the private part, so I guess it's okay to talk about anything. But
Yeah.
one of the problems that I've always had is I'm not anti-vax. Vaccines can be very beneficial, but you test it. You don't throw something together 5 minutes and then inject it into somebody. That's just asking for trouble. Normally, you wait a decade. So we've had this last vaccine, which has helped some people and killed some people, according to some of the reports. There's always problems from both sides of the COVID, and everything. But the main problem I see, that's always been, when they come up with any vaccine, there's always some people that react badly to it until they get it fixed, and then if you're taking a vaccine that's been around for a decade or two, it's probably safe, but the whole idea though, that this stuff comes back, and the push to hurry up and change your genetics to make you where you're over, immune to these things, rather than doing it the old-fashioned way, is just the push that's beginning to go down that road. I don't necessarily think it's even linked to the mark of the beast. Maybe, maybe not, but it's going that direction. And we need to, as Christians, resist that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely, especially today. Is there anything in the scrolls or anything that actually talks about how the process worked? Like what the writings of the Watchers actually said? Like what was the process to actually bring back these hybrids or these Nephilim, or do we just not know?
Yeah, actually, there's one of the scrolls called the Book of Giants in the Dead Sea Scrolls, kind of explains how it works, and it gave an example of taking a sheep and a goat, and you make a half sheep, half goat type thing, and like a donkey and a horse make a mule, and a lot of times those are sterile, of course, so you can't really go forward with them. But instead of mixing genetics using test tubes and all this kind of stuff, if you know the outcome or how to do it, you just simply mate them, and then if they're not in heat, there's ways to make certain smells to get them in heat and things like that. But the whole concept, when you read the whole thing, it talks about how they took 200 horses and 200 donkeys, and then that produced at least 200 mules. And then, of course, if two specific kinds don't make the one that can reproduce, then you just kind of rotate them. So you could create hundreds of mules, and out of those hundreds of mules, you probably have at least a handful that can reproduce. Okay, and then you go forward with that. So what they're doing is they have to know ahead of time, I guess, what they're looking for, and the angels would. But you take two similar life forms, mate them together, get some that's whole and can reproduce, and it's an unstable life form. Today, we would just simply look at the chromosome count. Horses are here, donkeys are here, mules are right in the middle. And so it created an unstable life form, because most of the time, if you tried to mate one thing with another, it's different enough that it just doesn't take. There's even no pregnancy. It just doesn't work. So there's other things to do. And there's probably herbs to make sure there's no spontaneous abortions and stuff like that, because I know there's herbs to do the opposite too. So, but it just described this whole process. And to me, it's interesting because there's stuff in the Middle Ages, like those grimoires. It's like, well, how do you do this? Well, you shake your head and walk around the table 3 times and you say these magic words. And you and I would look at it and say, that won't do anything. It's just stupid, But this actually is like, no, it's a mating process. You have to do it just the right way. So if that would work, and if we would try to do that, that's exactly how we would do it. So it's fascinating to look at that. And then, of course, now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, somebody starts experimenting. I think some of our scientists are reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually, and doing what Canaan did. It's like, I don't care. I'm going to recreate it. And the spooky thing about it is, once this can of worms is opened up, there's no going back, because we have laws on the books saying we don't experiment with human embryos. We're just not going there. But when China does and Russia does and other superpowers do, and they may be successful, the military doesn't say, oh, well. The military follows directions to figure out how to fix that or how to make one better. So it's, no matter what the laws are, somebody somewhere will continue to do this and have lots of disastrous, things going nowhere. But eventually somebody will create something that works, like the Nephilim clans, or a virus that works, or something like that. And that's kind of what was prophesied, I believe.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and we live in strange times, and it's kind of exciting to talk about it, because we realize, if things are getting that bad in the world, we're just that much closer to when things actually get fixed, which is great. Michael has a question. I believe I've heard him say that Enoch prophecies in the Bible and states that. Oh, okay. It's worded a little weird, but I think what he's asking is, basically somewhere in Enoch it says that Enoch's not supposed to be in the Bible. He's looking for that verse and can't find it. And then just to add on to that, yeah, how should we as Christians look at the book of Enoch, and should it be included in the Bible? Should it not? Do we look at it as scripture or just history? What do you think?
Well, just like in the first century, you have some people think there aren't prophets anymore. Okay, and so even if that's the case, in the first century, there were prophets like Agabus. And so they made prophecies. They may or may not have made any end time prophecies. I don't know. But if they did, they would have wrote them down in a book. Presumably, we would have got that in the canon, but you don't know. So just because there is a real prophet that has a real gift of prophecy or word of wisdom, word of knowledge for a person or for a group or for a later century, doesn't necessarily mean all of those are in the Bible. And it doesn't mean that just because it's not in the Bible, it's got to be fake. So that's something that we have a problem with. That kind of a tradition has come from 1,000 years of false prophets trying to get right junk and all the cults and stuff. So we do need to be very, very careful of that kind of stuff. The early church fathers said that they believed that the book of Enoch, what we call First Enoch, is the book of Enoch. And there were several others that were written, like Second Enoch, Third Enoch, and things like that, that are written by cults. That's one really nice thing about the church fathers. Sometimes they'll come out and say, no, this is a fake book. We know it was written by a guy down the street. It was a certain cult. They're called this. They wrote it for this reason. The guy's in jail. I mean, they tell you all this history. And so that's really fantastic when they do. But yeah, in Book of Enoch, I think it's like 105 or something like that. He talks about the fact that there will be a collection of books that the righteous live their life by. So that's our canon. Okay. And then it mentions that his is not supposed to be included in that collection of books. And then in chapter 1, actually, he says that the book is addressed to those people that live in the time of tribulation. And then there's even that quote out of that Jude gives about when the Lord comes back with 10,000s of his saints. So we're talking about the end of the age of grace, the establishment of the kingdom, not necessarily right then, but that 50 or 100 years or whatever toward that time period. So you get the idea that this is supposed to be outside the canon and separate. And the reason for that is, if you just think about it, it's logical, because if you come up to a person and say, you need to be a Christian, here, read the Bible. The Bible consists of 5,300 and some books. Some people are going to say, I'm just going to hell then, because I can't read that much. Just forget about it. You know, and so the Bible is designed, as Peter said, all that you need for a life of godliness and faith is contained even in the New Testament. If you just read the New Testament and believe it, you can be saved, and that's really all you need. However, the more you know, the better. And like lawyers and doctors constantly study and learn new things and have libraries of like a couple of hundred books in the back, you know, that are pretty complex. So we can do the same thing, or at least some of us can study that, anybody that wants to. But since there are so many fake books, you need to be very, very familiar with the New Testament and fairly familiar with the Old before you get into that kind of stuff. For instance, I talked a while ago about the Testament of Noah. Fantastic. It contains real prophecy, which is corroborated by Daniel. Very, very good. However, there is a book and there's a Testament of Abraham actually too. There's also a book of Abraham that is part of the Mormon group of canon. And so when you look at that, you can tell it's basically nothing. So just because it's got somebody's name on it, you know, and it's supposed to be old, doesn't mean it is. So there's a real book by that name and a fake book by that name. So we just got to be careful of all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Russell is asking, was Yeshua and the Essenes a vegetarian?
No, that would be against the law. They have to observe the Passover Seder, which is the eating of the Passover lamb. Peter was still a fisherman. So, and even Paul says this whole concept of not eating meat is a doctrine of demons. Not that you can be a vegetarian. If your doctor says you have some oddball problems, I strongly suggest you eat peanut butter and leave beef alone or whatever. Follow what your doctor tells you, unless he's giving you Nephilim medicine. But you know, this kind of stuff you need to be careful of. But it's not a physical um, reason for eating meat. This is a spiritual one. The concept is that if you are a vegetarian or you're this or that, you'll be more spiritual. God will like you better. And that's got nothing to do with anything. So there is a fake document called the Essene Gospel of Peace. And there's a Gospel of Barnabas that is sometimes used by the Muslims that talk about Jesus being a vegetarian and stuff like that. But that obviously was not true. I mean, he ate the Passover meal with his disciples. And the whole idea that, when, Paul talked about that we messed up, or the Corinthians messed up the communion. And that's why some of us are dead or asleep. Don't mess up the ritual. You don't have to do rituals. So either do it or don't do it. But if you do it properly. So nobody's going to do a Passover Seder and not eat the lamb, right? So that kind of thing. And so they were not vegetarian. This is pretty obvious too, because there's been several digs in the Qumran area that have brought up Passover meals. I guess they had the idea that it's so sacred they didn't want to throw the trash away; they just bury it. And so there's the bones of the lambs and stuff like that. So they were obviously not ate meat. And along with that, we have to understand that kind of stuff comes in Genesis 9. You have part of the Noahide laws, and we're told as people, as nations, Gentile nations, to eat anything that moves as long as you kill it and cook it properly so you don't get sick. So anything you want to eat it. Then in Leviticus, you have the Jews, mainly the priests, being told you have to eat kosher. Okay, you only eat these things. These are forbidden. These are okay. Then in Deuteronomy, which is right after that, you have, like in Deuteronomy 14:21, you have the account of you're a Jew, you have a cow, it dies without being slaughtered. So now it's no longer kosher and you can't eat it. So what do you do with it? You give it to the Gentiles because they eat that stuff, the ones that live in your gates, in your cities. So you've got this, if you look at it very carefully, this whole concept. We're not Jewish priests, so there's a ton of those laws that don't apply to us. Just like even if I was Jewish and my wife gave birth, she would do the ritual for giving birth. I don't give birth. I'm a guy. I'm just different. So there's all these different sets of laws, and it's all one system of law, but we don't want to mix them up. And that's why Paul said to be very careful to divide the word of truth appropriately.
Amen. Ruth is asking, given that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1940s, why do the Essenes start to be heard of about 10 years ago or less? Or is that just my ignorance?
No, actually, that's a pretty good understanding. The first of the scrolls came out in the 40s, and then there were some in the 50s, and then there was a few other things found later. But what happened was the big scrolls, which are mainly multiple copies of the scriptures, like we've got 38 copies of Deuteronomy and things like that. It's just Deuteronomy. Everybody already has those. So there's no danger in releasing those to the public because you can't cause a controversy when it's exactly the same thing. So we have a whole lot of them that are highly fragmented. I mean, so much that maybe they're about this big and there's 2 letters on them. Who knows what that means? There's no way to kind of put those together. But the others are fragmented, and some of them are not fragmented, but they actually give Essene theology. That's where the danger came out. It's like, I'm not sure we want everybody to know this. Because like when you read 11Q13, you find out that the Messiah is our Melchizedekian priest. He's actually God incarnate. He comes to die and pay the penalty for our iniquity. It happens in 32 AD. And because of that, the age of grace begins. And then it begins to talk about several other prophetic things. So be that as it may, that's apparently what they believed, or whoever wrote that one scroll. And so when that comes out, you've got a lot of people going, I'm not sure about this. Some of the texts talk about you only pray to God. You don't pray to angels or people. So the Catholic people are like, we don't want that to go out, And there were copies of some of the Apocrypha. So some of the Protestants may not necessarily want you to know that, and things like that. But I think mainly what happened was in the 1990s, one of the professors or one of the archaeologists actually had his own copies, photos of everything. He died and he bequeathed his whole set to the Huntington Library. And they said, cool, we'll publish it. So they actually published it. I think it was in 1991. And then instantly there's this lawsuit for the powers that be said that belongs to us. And there's he was working for him at the time. Technically, it's their property, etc. So it actually went to the Supreme Court, I think, of California. But anyway, the obvious ruling is that the copyright goes to the people who wrote it. They've been dead 2,000 years. So it's public domain. So they were allowed to publish it. So the full text for people to study has only been out about 22 years, 24 years, something like that. And so that's not a time for any denomination to study it and go, you know what, we need to change some things. So it's really, really new information as far as that goes. It's politics, basically.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's do one more. We actually have like dozens of questions, but if we do all of them, we'll be here for 5 hours. So we'll do one more before we let you go. Zeph is asking, is the Book of Nicodemus a reliable source of truth, as well as Pontius Pilate report? Recently been reading these releases from the Vatican treasure trove.
I haven't read the recent releases, but I studied them in seminary. And there's a couple of different versions of each of those. And so some of them definitely have some historical problems. There's one or two versions that are Gnostic, and there's others that don't seem to have any problems, but we don't know if they're fiction or not. The church fathers do talk about Pilate and about his suicide afterwards and his imprisonment and that kind of stuff. Basically, when you get Caesar that heals, there's this Messiah guy. He hears about this Messiah guy over there and that he can heal people without herbs. And I have a problem. I want him here now. What? You killed him? So he's in serious trouble. So you can see why this is probably correct in what's going on. But there's a lot of things that do tend to contradict in different manuscripts. So first off, knowing that there are multiple copies and they're all slightly different, I can't say that there's at least one of them that's not correct. We'd have to go back and really look at that. And that's something that I plan on doing in the future, but there's just so many scrolls to look at. And I think it's more important to look at the scrolls, specifically the prophetic part, that might help us to understand something now than back then. But that would definitely be worth looking into.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds really interesting. Well, I guess that's it for today, Ken. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us and answering some of the viewer questions. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank all of you once again for being members and for supporting Daily Renegade. Head on over to Ken's website too, BibleFacts.org, and he does live streams every Monday. So you want to make sure that you check those out. All right, everybody. Until next time, love you all. Take care and God bless.
Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I'm your host, Josh Peck. We have a very special returning guest today. I'm very excited for today's program. We welcome back to the show Dr. Ken Johnson. Ken, how are you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, anytime. Absolutely. Well, you got a new book out, which it's funny the way this worked out because we didn't plan this or anything, but your book and I just put out a 2-volume set on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and our books came out like at a really similar time, and both on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm really excited about yours. I've read it through. It's amazing. One of your best, in my opinion. It's called Ancient Prophecies from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's going to be the topic of today's show for everybody that's watching. So let's start with, where you start off in the book, the Essene community and how the discovery of the scrolls was actually predicted. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. In Isaiah chapter 29, it talks about a time when Israel comes back. And it starts off just real briefly. God is angry with Israel, and then he sides with the invading forces and obliterates Israel. Well, that has to be 70 AD. And then all of a sudden it kind of switches. It doesn't tell you it's switching, but you know how prophecy is. But all of a sudden now the Lord is bringing him back. He's angry with the other guys. They're going to attack Israel, but the Lord wipes them out like it was a bad dream, just like in a second. So it's obviously two separate wars. So if it was 70 AD when they left, it has to be 1948 when they come back. And then it says in that time period when they come back and the war happens and is over in just a matter of days, the old ones begin to speak out of the dust of the earth. And so if you take that literally and know the history of the scrolls, where the main professor had to wait for funding to go buy the first scroll, finally got enough money, went down to buy the first scroll, which happened to be the great Isaiah scroll where that prophecy is at, and then realized that morning he bought it, and he started to go back to the university with it and found out he couldn't get there because apparently, not being into politics, he learns later that Israel declared itself to be a nation and the war started. So, I mean, you can't get closer than that within a single day. So it's an amazing story that they tell, a historical story. But with that in mind, then Isaiah 29 is telling us at a certain point, the old ones would begin to speak, and we would have at the very least history, if not other prophecy. And apparently we should pay attention to it, much like Daniel says in chapter 11 and 12, that knowledge will increase in the last days.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point in history, and a lot of people look to that time to as sort of like that's where the countdown, for prophetic things begins, and like that's where like the end, almost like that's where the end times, or like the last part of our age or something. We can look to Israel for these things. Do you agree with that? Do you think that 1940? Do you think that time was really significant prophetically, where we could look at that and see like, okay, now we can really start counting down the time till the Lord's return?
Yeah, I think so. We can't really set a date per se, but at the same time, there's all these points of generations and jubilees. They have their own calendar system. And the church fathers, when you plug in the church fathers that are not connected at all with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when you plug them in, they have records of the school of the prophets, the extra biblical writings, who did what. And Irenaeus actually said that the birth pangs time that Jesus talked about starts when Israel comes back. And at that point, knowledge would increase because we would see more and more prophecies fulfilled. So when we're confused at, say, 20 prophecies, and in the next 5 years, 10 of them are fulfilled, and we know exactly what the symbols mean, we should be able to understand the rest of them pretty accurately. So that was kind of a common teaching all the way through the early church.
That's absolutely fascinating. What an exciting time to be alive. And one of the most important things about the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most fascinating things to me anyway, is, and I know to you too, is the Essene calendar. And you write about that in this book, and you specifically bring up the scroll 4Q252 through 254. What is the Essene calendar, and what did you discover about it, and what if anything does it say about our time today?
Well, basically, it's the same calendar in the Bible. And of course, I can't verify this because I'm not 2,000 years old. But their concept is God gave a calendar, kind of like in Genesis when it says, observe the seventh day Sabbath and keep the cycle going. It's a calendar type thing. And so their idea is that creation started on the fourth, or the creation week, rather. The fourth day of that week is when the sun, moon, and stars were created, and that's when you can start a calendar count. So their New Year's always starts on a Wednesday, and they say that the weeks were never altered. So theoretically, our Sabbath Saturday is still Saturday. So, and again, I can't really prove that, but that's what they teach. And they basically started going through beginning to beginning. They would mount years to Shemitahs, to Jubilees, to Onas, to ages, and they have this count. And the neat thing about it is they have in 11Q13, it talks about the Melchizedekian priest, who is God incarnate, would come and pay some sort of penalty to erase the debt of our iniquities. And that somehow reconciles us to God and starts the age of grace. And it says that this time period, or the event, whatever the event is that takes this, and of course we know that to be his death on the cross, but the event is one Shemitah after the end of the ninth Jubilee of their Ona in that age. And so if you plug that into our calendar, it comes out to 32 AD, give or take a year, but So I'm not arguing dates per se, but that's pretty accurate. And that gives us an idea of the end of our age as being 2075. So we're getting ready to enter that last Jubilee in about a year and a half. So that's when time really comes up. In the book, I also have several quotes where they talk about the idea that um, at during the middle time period, just in general, not too many prophecies are fulfilled. But when you near the end of an age, especially, or sometimes even the end of a jubilee period, you have a lot more prophecies fulfilled. And so that's why I was guessing, we probably wouldn't see much of anything until at least 2 years from now. And I was wrong, happily. But there's a lot of things going on, and not just the Israeli Hamas war and Hezbollah, which are all prophesied in Scripture, and then several other things. But all these things begin a time period, and there's other things in the scrolls too that talk about that.
When we talk about jubilees, is there a difference between a jubilee and a generation, or is the concept of those the same? Is a generation 50 years?
Generally speaking, a generation is from the birth of a person to the birth of their firstborn son. And so, in other words, like if I was a king, I'd be ruling when my firstborn son was born. That begins his generation. And then, or sometimes it's actually when I take over and when he takes over. But generally, it's a generational count. So it's an unknown number of years. If I had a child when I was 15 or when I'm 50, my first, it just all depends. A jubilee is always 50 years, period. But sometimes, depending on the prophecy, there's prophecies about, like in Enoch, it talks about a 70 generational count from Enoch's time to the Messiah. And when we looked that up in Luke, that was exactly correct. Now, I did some math on it, though. I took the time period of its start and its ending, divided it by 50, or no, by 70 for the generations, just to see how many years an average generation is. And it came out to be 48.9 or something like that on average. I thought that was pretty interesting. But sometimes, though, in the text, they will use them interchangeably. And the way you can do this is you can look through the New Testament when it's talking about generations, and then go back, especially if it's quoting an Old Testament one. Go back and look that up, and then flip it over to the Septuagint and see what Greek word is used, and you'll come to find out a lot of times a jubilee is a generation.
Hmm. That's really interesting. So when Jesus says that this generation will not pass, do you think that that's just like it just means that the generation that's alive, there's not going to be a new generation that comes after that before all these things are fulfilled, or do you think that he was speaking about a specific time period?
I've always thought that he just means a general generation like that. So, in other words, there's still someone alive that saw the beginning that will see the end.
Hmm.
So, when it starts, for instance, it's not going to last 200 years because nobody would still be around. Um, but then again, what is interesting to me is the rapture hasn't happened yet. Some of the major prophecies, tribulation, Antichrist hasn't happened yet. And if it doesn't happen in the next year and a half, it'll be the same thing. It will be in that last generation or that last jubilee.
Yeah,
So,
that
it could happen at any time, but to me, it's interesting that they would change those around, and it could mean either or.
yeah, that makes sense. And either way we look at it, it really seems like we're heading towards that time now. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were kept by the Zadokian priesthood in Qumran. What set the Qumran beliefs apart from other beliefs at the time, say of the Pharisees and Sadducees and others?
Well, basically, they talked a lot about. Well, the idea is that there are just Jews, and basic Judaism is Judaism, the way it has always been taught. And they say they are the real original Jews with the real original theology. So, and what they teach is that there's one God, but somehow he manifests in three forms as Messiah, as Hashem, and as the Ruach HaKodesh. And they're prophets. They know the Holy Spirit very well. So they have that concept. That we have a sin nature. Messiah comes to die for our sin nature. many texts like that. Like they talk about the fact that the teacher of righteousness came and was killed by an evil priest approximately 40 years before the destruction of the temple. So there's a whole lot of details in there. But that's their theology. And the idea is somewhere along the line, cults sprung up. And so you got Pharisees and Sadducees, and somehow the cults took over the government. So it's much like you and I being a Christian, and we believe that same story about the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah, and say there's some Christian cult that doesn't believe Jesus even existed and all this kind of stuff, and somehow they become president, take over the United States, and that's what we would be in that same boat then. It's like, no, we're the real Christians. These guys are cults. And that's their story. Now, of course, the Sadducees and Pharisees that tell the opposite. But what I think is interesting is in the scriptures, we're told that the Sadducees don't believe in spirits. They don't believe in the Holy Spirit. So once you're dead, you're dead. There is no life afterwards. And that's obviously not scriptural. And the Pharisees believed some of that, but not others. And so just by going by the New Testament, which I would as a Christian, I would say all those guys are wrong. And it's fascinating to me because a Jew is today, an Israeli, is taught, ignore Christians, they're a cult. The rabbis say totally different story. Okay, so that makes sense. But then you dig up the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are theoretically their great grandfathers, that tell the story. No, we believe just like the Christians. We're waiting for it to happen just like the Christians said it did. And there's going to be an apostasy hit that's going to tell you the opposite. Well, that's the rabbis. So no matter how you look at it, there's two different sides. It's not that Christians invented the New Testament. There's always been these two sides. So you have to decide whether you're going to believe rabbinical Judaism or your great grandfathers. So it's one of those things. And that is an amazing position for the Lord to put them in. You know, Paul says in Romans that eventually all Israel will be saved. So they will become a messianic nation eventually. And I see the Dead Sea Scrolls as playing a major part of that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, for sure. People seem to be waking up more and more to it the more time goes on. You know, one question that I always get a lot, and I'm sure you do too, is why don't we see, you know, the word Essene, or why don't we see the Essenes mentioned in the Bible, or are they in the gospel somewhere under a different name? If we were to try to point out where the Essenes are in the Bible, why don't we have that word, and where would we point to show, well, this is what it means? These are the Essenes.
Yeah, well, number one, remember they said that they are the original Jews, and they tend to refer to themselves as Jews. And so that word is all the way through the New Testament. But the thing is, the word Essene is a Greek word that means healer. And that's basically what the Greek people would call them. The Hebrew people would call them the sons of Zadok, or there's the priest, that kind of thing, which is interesting if you think about it. You've got the real Zadok priests that are supposed to be ruling, and you've got this cult that comes up that takes over. So what do? They call themselves Sadducee or Zadoki, you know, trying to convince people they are the real Zadok priests and not. So you see that kind of stuff in there. So other than that, it's not mentioned a whole lot because I think mainly when you give a name to someone, you're doing it because there's a problem. We're all Jews. We're waiting for Messiah. That's all we need to know, except that nut over there. So we got to give him a name, you know, a Sadducee, a Pharisee, a Samaritan. Samaritans might be nice people, but they only took like the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They reject everything else. Okay, they're nuts. You know, it's just, so we're going to call them this name, we're going to call them that name, not in a bad way, but just to label them. So you've got this, but you've got a lot of Essenes. For instance, in Acts chapter, I think it's chapter 13, it's when the prophets came down from Antioch to lay hands on Barnabas and Paul and anoint them for ministry. It says that there were 3 major guys that came down. One of them was in our Bible, it says Manaen, who was the Manaen who was with Herod in his household. Okay, so that tells us everything we need to know. The Hebrew way of saying that name is Menachem, and there's a whole history of Menachem the Essene, how he ran the Sanhedrin, and then when they begin to apostatize, he said, no, I'm keeping the original teaching and I leave. And so they call him a heretic. He leaves and kind of disappears. And that's when Hillel takes over. So, Hillel and Shammai, two of the main famous rabbis. But what happens is, of course, he's a Christian. He's waiting, and he comes down at this point. He's got to be at least in his 90s or 100, 102, something like that, at least, to anoint Paul, coming down from Antioch all the way to Jerusalem. And it's interesting because they're called Essenes, meaning healers, but they have this concept that if you do the herbal medicine and you have a simple lifestyle and you dedicate yourself to the Lord, you normally live to be 120. That's just kind of standard. Almost all of them do. The Pharisees and Sadducees might live to be 70 or 80 if they have a really cushy, place and lots of good food and that kind of stuff. The average Gentile lived to be about 60 back in that day, is from what we understand. So you've got this 90-year-old guy hopping on a donkey and coming all the way down here to anoint Paul. And it's just interesting to see that. He's got to have an Essene diet. He's got to have a long lifespan. He's filled with the Holy Spirit. So obviously he's a Christian. Otherwise he wouldn't be filled with the Spirit and still prophesying. And so that goes along with what the church fathers say about after the coming of Messiah. Doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile, but you have to be a believer in Messiah to experience the gifts. So that's just one example, but there's others in there. And I think we get stuck on the names sometime. Scribes, by the way, is there's a couple of different kinds of scribes. Some scribes might be referring to Essenes. Other scribes are the ones that just write court documents, scribes. And then there was a scribal group or denomination that I thought was fascinating, because the Pharisees said, we're going to follow this oral Torah. And the Essenes would say oral Torah is junk because we have the writings of the patriarchs. So we're following patriarchal history in the Old Testament. The scribes, on the other hand, said, we're not going to take sides in that. So we're not going to look at any history, any theology. We're just going to read the Bible and take wild guesses on what we think it means. And I thought it's interesting when you look at it like that. Jesus was always yelling at the scribes and the Pharisees, they're hypocrites. And you can see why. It's like you're trying to teach real history, teach everything correctly, but you don't want to look at history and add it to the Bible or anything like that. So it's really interesting to see. And we kind of have that parallel today in our society. People will say, well, let's not look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not in the Bible. But it's mentioned. It's part of history. It's kind of important.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and yeah, it is important. And also, if it was included in the Bible would be so big nobody would have the time to read it. I mean, it's already hard enough to even get Christians to read the Bible with the length. Imagine if it was twice or three times the size. Something that the Dead Sea Scrolls do, which is really interesting, is they provide commentaries on biblical texts that we're familiar with. And in some of those commentaries, there's a lot of prophecy that can be found. And you dedicated a whole section of your book to prophetic commentaries. I'd love to go through some of these and just have you talk about what you found in these commentaries that really stuck out. So let's start with the Genesis commentary. What's in there and what stuck out to you prophetically?
Well, number one, they go through and they give us chapter 7 of Genesis, the flood account and everything, but they will plug in the actual dates. Our Genesis says that the flood occurred on the 17th of the second month in the 600th year of Noah's life. So that's ER 1656 on the calendar. But they would actually go so far as to say, well, that day was Sunday, and it was this, and it was that. So they give you all the days of the week, all that kind of stuff. If their calendar is correct, and that's the one that has always been used, those dates would be absolutely correct. So it's really neat to see that kind of stuff. And when you look at prophecies and comments and other scriptures, that corroborates it. So, for instance, I've always wondered when Jesus said something happens and 3 days later this other thing happened. Why does it say 3 days later? Because I have no clue when it started. There's no way I could figure out when it happened. It's a waste of time. There's no way to figure it out. If you use the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, you'll know exactly what day it is. If it's a festival or if it's close to a Sabbath or whatever, it just clicks. And so it makes sense because the scripture wouldn't add other stuff like that. But there's prophecies about the Messiah, the one that would do different things. And we look at those as Christians, like in Genesis, and say, well, that's obviously a prophecy about the Messiah. Modern day Judaism would say, no, it means something else. And you got the Dead Sea Scrolls saying, nah, it means Messiah. And that's what's fascinating about all of these things.
Yeah, I agree. The calendar to me is really fascinating because you can take that calendar and apply it from Genesis to Revelation. I mean, even the prophetic day counts fit within this calendar. Since it came up, I should mention too for people at home, if you want a print version of this calendar, Dr. Ken Johnson and I do have that available. You can go to his website, BibleFacts.org, or you can go to DailyRenegade.com to get that, or you can just click on the link in the description below. But it's the Dead Sea Scroll calendar with all of the festivals and feasts. Ken put the whole thing together. All I did was just put it into print form. But it also has our regular calendar attached to it, so you can compare like today's date and see if today falls on a feast day, or you can, if a major event happens in Israel, if they start a war or something, or well, they don't really start wars, but if they, if a battle happens or something, you can you can look at that date and see, okay, this is on this festival. And it also has all the new festivals too that most of us don't know about. In Leviticus, we have 7 of them mentioned, but in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are as many as 12 from what it appears, which actually, it kind of makes more sense because there's prophecies about like time, and half a time. And that is, that's the word Moedim. It means a festival cycle. Well, if it's only 7, how do you have half of 7? It's either going to be 3/4 or 4/3. You can't really have half. If there's 12, you can have exactly half. So for that, if anybody's interested, you can just click on the link in the description below, or go to BibleFacts.org for Ken's website, or go to DailyRenegade.com for mine. And the proceeds go to help both of our ministries. We split everything down the middle, so you're supporting two great ministries with that. Okay, so. And these commentaries are really fascinating because they do talk a lot about their time and prophecies they were looking forward to, but also some in our time too. What are some of the things that stuck out to you about our time from there's a bunch of commentaries. We wouldn't have time to go through all of them. There's probably at least a dozen or more here in your book. And the way the book's laid out for everybody at home, it's really easy to read. Like Ken will actually, he puts the actual section of the Dead Sea Scrolls and then provides his own commentary and kind of helps explain. So it's really easy to read and really informative. But what are some of the ones that really stuck out to you about our time? What's happening now and what we might be looking forward to in the near future?
Well, in the commentary section, there's some really interesting ones. For instance, I remember going through seminary and we looked at the Valley of Dry Bones, and there were several theories on what it meant. Most of us thought it was prophecy, not resurrection. And some people said, well, it could be 537 BC coming back from Babylon, or 1948, or both. It could just be symbolic, that kind of thing. In the commentary in Ezekiel, though, they have a section on Ezekiel 37. And basically, they have 2 separate events where the same thing happens. One is when Israel comes back filled with the Spirit, and the other one is when they come back not filled with the Spirit. And so that's pretty obvious because they talk about the fact when they come back under Ezra, Nehemiah, that kind of stuff, they have 11Q13, this concept that the Messiah is God incarnate that dies for their sins. So they're obviously filled with the Spirit. They're following that kind of thing. And when Israel comes back in 1948, they're not messianic. So when you look at that, it's pretty obvious according to that text. Our Ezekiel 37 only has them coming back with not filled with the Spirit. So number one, that tells us that Ezekiel chapter 37 in our Bibles is specifically talking about 1948, period. And I thought that was fascinating. Anytime you can isolate something like that and know for sure, then you begin to see other things instead of speculating on what it might be, or it may prove something else to be wrong. So it's kind of neat to see that, this whole concept. And there's a lot of other things. For instance, in Habakkuk chapter 2, Paul quotes that in 3 places in the New Testament. and he's explaining how the just are saved by faith, not sacrifices, but faith in the Messiah. And he seems to indicate in Galatians that that's how Abraham was saved, by trusting in what the Messiah would do when he comes, however he fixes it. And so modern rabbis would say, no, it's got nothing to do with the Jesus or anything like that. It's just faith in God, that God will take care of things. Well, the commentary specifically says the just live by faith in what the teacher of righteousness will do when he comes. So they make it very, very clear. It can't be faith in potatoes or your church or whatever. It's faith in the Messiah. So again, for us as Christians, it's very clear, but it's an incredible witness to Jews. The just live by faith. You can't live by the law of Moses. I mean, you need to follow that if you're in that culture, but that's not how salvation is based. It's by trusting Messiah. Well, who is Messiah? He's the one that was killed 40 years before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The one that did these other things, the one that is bringing salvation, that is God incarnate, that does all these things. So it's repeated over and over again. And there is a ton of first coming prophecies, extra biblical ones, for instance, and then the commentaries on those. And then there are some that are for the second coming, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that because I find that absolutely fascinating too. Before we do, we are going to take a quick break. So everybody just hold on the line. We'll be right back with Ken Johnson. I would ask that you go visit dailyrenegade.com and become a member today. Not only do you get early access to full videos, but there's a lot of things I just can't put out on YouTube for fear that they'll delete videos or delete the entire channel, and I can't put the channel at risk. There are certain things, and those of you who have followed me for a while know, there are certain things that I've made documentaries about that I cannot mention on YouTube, or my entire channel will get removed. A ministry that I previously worked for had this happen recently because of exactly this. So, and I've had this happen multiple times too. So this is why I created Daily Renegade. It's a place where we don't have to worry about censorship. You can go, you can watch all the videos, you can watch the full videos of everything. And there's even a community tab that works pretty much exactly like Facebook without the censorship. So members of Daily Renegade, we can all communicate with each other. You can post, you can put pictures up, you can make your own account. It's really exactly like Facebook. There's just no censorship. Now, again, I do run the site. If I see somebody cussing somebody out, I'm going to remove them. But so far, I have not had one problem with trolls because, let's face it, trolls are pathetic, right? They're not going to spend their own money to go and troll somebody. They'll just do it for free on YouTube. So we'll leave the filth with YouTube. At dailyrenegade.com, we're actually creating something really nice. So the video section works exactly like YouTube. It looks really, really similar. It has the same layout. You get your own profile. You can favorite videos. You can share things. You can comment. I mean, it has the same layout as YouTube. It just does not have the censorship. And it's the same with the community tab. So at dailyrenegade.com, yes, there is a membership fee because there has to be. I'm not rich. I didn't get into full-time ministry to become rich, you know. So I can't afford to do it all on my own. So there is a membership, but that goes towards keeping Daily Renegade afloat. But also it helps with what we're trying to do. We want to make a phone app and a TV app so that Daily Renegade will be even easier to access. Right now, you can go on your phone and just go dailyrenegade.com and it works great. It works beautifully now. We had problems with an earlier website that we went through a different service. We went through Wix. And we got rid of that. That's done. So if you're happening to view this and you're thinking, oh, I remember that site from 2 years ago and it was awful, I couldn't do anything. Please, I'm asking you, give us another chance because we have fixed all that. We fixed all the junk. It was expensive to do, but it's because of people supporting Daily Renegade, getting memberships and even donating that we're able to do that. So it works great now, and now we want to take it to the next step. We want to make a phone app, and we want to make a TV app. So dailyrenegade.com is where you can get that. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year, and if you can do it, I suggest doing the $100 a year because it's cheaper in the long run. Essentially, you get 2 months for free. I also want to say too that we're still collecting donations. So many of you know the situation. I'll run through it very briefly. Two main things. One, 2 weeks before I got the job offer here for Prophecy Watchers, my wife and I had bought a house in Illinois. And once we got the job offer here, we knew it was a calling from God. We knew it. And so we had to take it. And it's great. I mean, I love working at Prophecy Watchers. I love everybody there. Feels like home, feels like a family. And it is a perfect fit for us. But the problem is we are renting a house here in Oklahoma, but we still have a house that we're trying to sell in Illinois. By the way, if you're in the Decatur, Illinois area and you're looking for a really nice 4-bedroom house, let me know. JoshPeckDisclosure@gmail.com. It's for sale now. But in the meantime, we don't know how long that house is going to sell. And anybody who knows anything about the economy knows this is a really bad time to try to sell a house. So it's been very difficult financially. It's been financially straining. And especially since, Illinois got hit with some storms and we had to pay to fix some damages there and stuff. We've had to put a lot of money into it. So while we're paying for a mortgage there, we're paying for rent at this house. So basically we got 2 huge payments. And I don't know how long that's going to last. The second our house sells, I will tell everybody on here, okay, we're good. You don't have to donate. Well, you don't have to donate at all, but we no longer need donations for our living situation. So we are accepting donations for that. We're also accepting because we have a big family. We have 5 kids, and we're a single income house. Christina stays at home, takes care of the kids, homeschools them, works really, really hard. And then I do my ministry work at Prophecy Watchers, and then on my off time on that, I work on Daily Renegade stuff. And anything that I make from Prophecy Watchers and Daily Renegade, that's it for our entire family. So once our house sells, it's going to be fine, but we just don't know how long that's going to last. And if that lasts months and stuff, we need some kind of savings. And whatever savings we had before we put into the first house, because we thought, well, there's a whole story behind that, why we had to buy the house otherwise we weren't going to have a place to live for much longer. And there's a whole thing. Nobody was unfair to us or anything like that. Like just the basic story was, I went to go work for Zach Drew for a while, for about 9 months, and at the time, I wasn't in the best. Just at the time, we were already dealing with financial problems because of our son's health care, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But so Zach said, well, I actually have a house that I'm trying to sell. You can stay in it rent free up until like this time. But by this time, we need to find out if you're going to buy it or if you're going to live somewhere else, or we'll need to figure out what to do because I won't be able to afford to just do that forever. And so that's what it was. So Zach helped us out a lot. But it got to that point, and again, this was 2 weeks before the Prophecy Watchers job offer. So I said, okay, we'll just buy the house from you. We'll make it really easy. You've been really generous. You've been helping us out. We don't have any other place around here where we can rent that can support all of us. So we'll just buy it from you. So we went through that whole process and bought the house, and then it was like 2 weeks after that I got the Prophecy Watchers job offer. And but again, like, I didn't move to Prophecy Watchers till months after that. So either way, even if I had gotten the job offer before buying the house, I still would have had to buy the house unless I absolutely wanted to financially ruin my very good friend Zach Drew, and there was just no way I was going to do that to him. So either way, I was going to have to. I was going to buy the house. Zach never told me I had to, but in my mind, I had to, because if I didn't, I would have totally messed up a really good friend, and I wouldn't have had there was no other place for me and the family to go, so it just wouldn't have worked. Anyway, so that's just kind of a brief rundown of why we're in the situation we're in. Prophecy Watchers has helped out a lot, but again, we don't know how long this is going to last. So until the house sells, I have to keep bringing it up and say, hey, if you feel led and if you want to donate, that would be extremely helpful. Best place is paypal.me/JoshPeckDisclosure. If you don't want to do that, I do have a Cash App. It's $JoshScottPeck. If you want to mail in something, a couple of people have mailed in checks just addressed to me to the Prophecy Watchers building. I don't have the exact address. I think it's I don't know what their PO box is, but I think it's on their website. So if you just want to go to prophecywatchers.com and look where to actually send in and look for a PO box where to send in or an address. I know the physical address of the building, but I honestly don't know if that's been made public, and I don't want to make it public if it hasn't, so I'm not going to do that. Also, we're still accepting donations for my son's healthcare. Very brief synopsis. He had cancer for years. We took him to St. Jude's, got it cured. But the chemo destroyed his immune system, and he's got a lot of long-lasting health issues because of that. So to reverse those health issues, Christina actually got her degree because of this whole thing in natural health and medicine, and so we're going the all-natural route. But that stuff is really expensive. Those treatments, those supplements, and I'm not talking about just supplements off of the shelf of Walmart. A lot of that's garbage, and it's not even real. But to actually get the real stuff that your body needs to heal, it's so expensive, and insurance does not cover it at all. So, and there's also medical treatments and things like that he needs. Very, very expensive, and we're having to pay out of pocket for that. So, again, for my family, I don't like having to ask all the time. And I'm not ever going to impose on you that you have to donate. You don't. You really don't. I would love it if you'd at least pray, though. That anybody can do that. If you're watching this video, you can pray. At least pray that and God has been providing. He's been doing great. But, just pray that continues. Pray for our wisdom. Pray for Nathan's health. Pray for our house to sell. There's a lot of things you can pray for that would help. I don't love having to bring this up every single time, but for my family, absolutely, I'm going to do that. It's especially if you're a man, it's not easy to ask for help. It's not easy to just put your personal details out there and admit when you need help. It's not easy, but I'll do anything for my family, and I'm sure you would too. So yeah, every single time I do this, every single time I get comments, I get emails, I get people that get annoyed that I'm even bringing it up. And I'll get comments that say, well, the gospel should be free. The gospel is free. I'm not selling the gospel. I'm not telling you that you have to give anything. You don't. But if you feel led, not just for me, for my family, for my kids, if you feel led, it would be incredibly helpful. And I'm not going to promise that you're going to get anything from it. That's up to God. I'm never going to be the kind of guy that says, sow a seed and if you do this, God will reward you. I don't know what God's going to do. And that shouldn't be why you give anyway. You should never give to get a reward for yourself. If you're giving because you're expecting God to reward you in some way, I'd rather you just not give at all, because that's like spiritually dangerous territory for you to be in, and I would suggest getting some actual good, solid foundational teaching of the teachings of Jesus and what he means when he says when he tells us to give with a cheerful heart and all that stuff. You don't expect things in return. We know that we're getting rewards in heaven. We know all that, but you shouldn't expect anything in return. All it is it's a gift that would really help us out a lot. And if anything, I mean, it helps. It makes it a little easier for me to make these videos. If I don't constantly have this stuff on my mind or have to plan out what we're going to do financially for the next bill, because all that stuff takes time. So I mean, if anything, you'll get more videos, but I'm not gonna say that any promises come from any of that. It's just a nice thing that would help us, and we'd appreciate it. But again, do it if the Lord leads you. If not, no worries. Just pray. If you can pray, that'd be great. So again, paypal.me/JoshPeckDisclosure or Cash App $JoshScottPeck. And we have not set a P.O. box up yet, but we will very soon. I actually just keep forgetting about it because we have so much stuff to do. We have so many things day to day that we have to focus on. We are still in that transition period, but we're getting through it. And actually, it's really been great. I do have some other links and things in the description below. I did recently take part in a webinar that's available or will be available at the end of May, I believe, at paulbegleyprophecy.com. And I talked about upcoming magnetic pole shifts, what that might have to do with prophecy, talked a little bit about geographic pole shifts, how all this relates to Bible prophecy, a lot of revelation in there. So I'd suggest checking out that webinar, paulbegleyprophecy.com. There's also an Orlando Prophecy Summit that's on demand right now, and if you use the promo code PECKOrlando24, all caps, all one word, and then you'll have full access to all videos and speakers. This is a Prophecy Watchers conference. And for more information on that, you can go to OrlandoProphecySummit.com or ProphecyWatchers.com. Also, if you haven't had a chance, check out Cornerstone Asset Metals. The economy is not great, and the value of our dollar is dropping by the day. So what we should do is invest in something that's more stable, like silver and gold. But the problem is there's a lot of scammers out there. There's a lot of people you can't trust, even people calling themselves Christians that you can't trust because they mark up their prices. Cornerstone doesn't do that. And if you look at any interview that I have on my YouTube channel and at dailyrenegade.com with Terry Saka, look at any of his interviews. He's a prophecy guy. He's a Nephilim guy like us. You know, he knows all this stuff, and he treats his business as a ministry. He's doing this as a service for brothers and sisters in Christ, especially when their retirement, their 401k, you know, your investments, even just your savings are in danger. So go to cornerstoneassetmetals.com, tell them that we sent you, and you can get a free report. You can ask questions. They're not salesmen. They're not going to be pushy with you. You can talk to them about Nephilim if you want to. You know, they're knowledgeable. They know what they're talking about, and they're not going to scam you. I've been working with them for years. I don't promote very many companies on this channel because of specifically that. I've got to actually really know and believe that and know firsthand that it's a solid company because I don't want to put all of you at risk. And I fully believe that about Cornerstone. We've talked a little bit about prophecy. We do have a Dead Sea Scroll prophecy calendar, a print calendar that you can put on your wall that tells the regular Gregorian date that we go through, and then has the Dead Sea Scroll prophetic calendar that I talk a lot about in my upcoming books, but also talked about in Lost Prophecies of Qumran. So if you want a print version of that, the link is in the description below. Okay, so I think that's it. All the donation stuff, everything. And again, I apologize that that takes a long time to get through sometimes, but again, I'm doing it, especially the donation stuff. I'm doing it for my family. See how fast I whipped through the rest of it? Because that's more, hey, if you want a calendar, buy a calendar. Great. You know, it does help support me, my family, my ministry, helps support Ken Johnson's ministry as well. You know, if you want to trade your 401k or your retirement into silver, I think it's a very, very, very smart thing to do. I think you should do that. But, you know, again, it's just what won't you do for your family? If I have to deal with some mean comments of people saying that, oh, he's just money grubbing, and no, I'm not. You don't have to give me anything. You don't got to buy anything. I'm still going to be putting free information out on YouTube. But if I have to deal with that, and then the good-hearted people of you who feel God calling you to give, and you do give, and that helps my family, of course I'll go through that. It's very, very minor persecution, you know, compared to stuff that other Christians are going through today. It's very, very minimal. All I have to do is just not read the comments, which typically I don't on YouTube. But that's the reason. It's just I'll do anything for my family, and this is one way that'll help. So okay, let's get back into it. Okay, we are back. I want to ask about some of the second coming prophecies. Before I do, though, where can people pick up your book and follow you online?
All my books are on Amazon. If you go to my website, BibleFacts.org, you'll be able to click on links and buy them directly from Amazon. Saves me the trouble of shipping and everything. So we've got, I think, 34 books total. On the Dead Sea Scrolls section, I think we have about 6 or 7. But I'm at BibleFacts.org. And on Monday nights, I teach on YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel. Again, the links are all there on the website. So we're doing really good. We're going through studying Enoch at the moment. We're almost finished with that, looking at some of those prophecies.
Excellent. And if anybody's interested in mine, the best place to get them is ProphecyWatchers.com. By the time this airs on YouTube, They should have the books in. They just put in an order with me, so I think it takes a week or two for them to get them. But if you're viewing this at dailyrenegade.com, I'm not sure that the books are there yet. They are on Amazon, but if you want, if you can wait, I would suggest that you wait and get them at Prophecy Watchers, because why support Jeff Bezos when you can support an awesome prophecy ministry and help them out? I will say, though, if you want the audiobook or the Kindle, I think that is only available on Amazon for mine. So, and then my new books, it's a 2-volume set. It's Forgotten Prophecies of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's up there as well, which reminds me, I gotta put up a banner on my website for that as well. Well, okay, we're gonna go to members only, and then I want to talk about prophecies relating to the second coming and then some other stuff as well. So again, for all of you out there, I said it in the break, but I'll just repeat it again. If you want to become a member, it's $10 a month or $100 a year at dailyrenegade.com, which goes to support what we're doing at Daily Renegade. We do that because of censorship issues. I already dealt with all that in the break, so I'm not going to rehash that. So we will, if you're a member, you don't have to do anything. Just keep watching. And if you are viewing on YouTube or Rumble, don't forget to subscribe. And if you believe you're subscribed, double check, because I've had a lot of people contact me and say that YouTube has been unsubscribing them from my channel. So double check, make sure you turn the bell on for all notifications. And until next time, take care and God bless. Okay, members only. Thank you all so much for being part of the family here at Daily Renegade. Hope you're enjoying it. Let's continue. Let's just get right back into it. So in the first half of the show, you mentioned that they have a lot of prophecies about the first coming and even some prophecies about the second coming. What prophecies did you find that really helped clear up some things that we read about in the Bible? Because of course there's a lot in the Bible about the second coming as well. But you know, we as Christians, we all seem to have different ideas of how to interpret these. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls help us understand a little clearer what to expect with the second coming of Christ?
Yeah, it's basically in a lot of our theologies, there's a lot of debate. First off, they were what I would call dispensationalist. Maybe not in the same way that we are today, but they basically have this concept that they're like, for instance, the Passover ritual. There was a Melchizedekian version. Moses changed it into what we consider the Passover Seder. It's supposed to change again when the Messiah comes to set up the age of grace. And then it's supposed to change again when we have the millennial reign. And they don't, speculate much on what it might be, but just to see that the differences, that right now we're priests, we have to fulfill the law of Moses. When the age of grace comes, this will be set aside. We'll be doing something different. And so they understand that kind of stuff. They talk a lot about the first coming prophecies because, number one, that's important to them. But that drifts over into the second coming prophecies a lot. For instance, one of the slams against them is to say apparently they were just a small Jewish cult because they thought they were going to take over the Roman Empire and rule the world, and Rome squished them. So they're gone, they're dead, we don't need to worry about it. And you might get that at first glance by looking at their text, because they talk about triumphing over Rome. But it's very, very clear that they're talking about a revived Roman Empire of some sort. And it's not them that are taking over, it's the Messiah establishing the kingdom. So we're very clearly talking about 2,000 years later. So you look at this stuff, and people are really easily wanting to dismiss things. A lot of people will say, well, the teacher of righteousness is probably the guy that founded the group. Couldn't be. If he died 40 years before the temple was destroyed, he'd be 300 years old. So unless, of course, that's Messiah or something, there's no way to get around that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
But they have a lot
yeah.
of things as far as Rome is concerned. They talk about how Rome is this empire, and it may morph and change places and ways it does something, but it's still the ancient empire. And we still have that today. I remember being taught in the seminary Rome died out in 476. Come to find out they were split, as prophesied in Daniel, and that Roman Empire ended in 1453, 1,000 years later. And then come to find out, according to the text in some of the scrolls, they continue so that's the Ottoman Empire was a continuation of that. So the Roman Empire, religion-wise, went from pagan to Christian to Muslim to probably something else. So we've got to look at those things closely. So then it fizzles out in 1917. There's an attempted revival in 1945 with World War II. And then Israel comes on the scene. So it's all perfectly succinct, I think. But they talk about this. There's going to be, right before the establishment of kingdom, there's going to be a 7-year period. No more, no less, exactly 7 years. There's going to be an evil Gentile king. We're not told from where, in the scrolls anyway, but this evil Gentile king is going to rule, and he's going to rule through a group of nations. We're not told 10 or any number, but just a group of nations. So it's delegated authority somehow. And he's going to try to attack and destroy Israel. The Messiah comes and destroys him, sets up a kingdom. So that's really specific. And there's some dateline prophecies set in there that we're not too sure, how that works exactly. But there's a lot of things like that. So most of it's corroborating what we know from Daniel, from the New Testament, from the book of Revelation. And then there's, it goes on and gives other details like that. Like, for instance, this Gentile king apparently is insane. He calls himself the Son of God, and the God incarnate, stuff like that, which is actually what Paul said he would do also, and talks about a rebuilt temple and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting details.
Yeah, for sure. And that 7 year period part really fascinated me. Because I know you have done your own translations on these. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is awesome. And
Yes.
I love the way that you do it, because it's really easy to read. I have a few different translations, and they vary in some are like really difficult because it's almost old English words that they'll use,
Yeah.
and then some are a little more modernized, so it's easy.
And other times it depends on how they translate it too.
Yeah.
I was talking online one time and I was talking about how they constantly talk about the age of grace that's coming, because Paul uses that term, and it's obviously the same thing. And so this guy calls in and says, I don't know where you're getting this, because I have all of it, and none of it anywhere says anything about age of grace or anything like that. So where are you getting this? And I said, well, it depends on, you're translating it. They'll probably say, I'm trying to put a Christian spin on it, and they're trying to put a non-Christian spin on it. But for instance, the words are, it could be translated age or kingdom, and then grace is unmerited favor. So it's either grace or favor, however you want to say it. And that's not really wrong or right. So you'll probably see it as kingdom of favor, which to me makes no sense. Kingdom of favor, age of grace makes much more sense. Anyway, and it was funny though, because he said, oh, kingdom of favor, is that what you're talking about? Yeah, that's all through there. And I'm like, that's my point. So there's a lot of things. Teacher of righteousness, who knows who that might be? Well, let them explain who it is.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, yeah. That's why I really like your translations. They're easy to read, and they do fit in, because yeah, you're right. A lot of the translations I have, it's almost like they're trying to get away from the Christian stuff that's really all throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that can alter the translation. There's a couple of scrolls that I know a lot of people are curious about, and I've wondered about too. And I'm curious to get your take, because I don't know how to read the original languages, and you do. So I have to go based on just how they're translated. So, like for example, when I read through the War Scroll, and I have a chapter about it in my book, but there's a lot that I can't make heads or tails out of, because I don't know if it's talking about Armageddon or a different war, because sometimes it's like there's 6 years of preparation, and there's but then in other places it seems like they're talking about like 40 years of this war. How would you explain the War Scroll? Like, what are we looking at? Is this like a patchwork of different things, or is this supposed to be one war, or what's being talked about in the War Scroll?
It could be. I didn't put it in this book. It's one of the few things left to work on, but it's not corrupted as in the form of having holes in the text per se. So it's pretty consistent together, but without an ending and a beginning, the commentary, it's kind of hard to tell. So we're talking about, my guess is we're talking about a war situation.
Mhm.
So, for instance, in modern Israel times, which has nothing to do with the war scroll, but in modern Israel, they've had an ongoing problem with Syria and with Hamas and stuff like that. And you could say it's been one long war, or you could say, well, there's actually been 4 wars over 80 years that, here, 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 and here. But those are just skirmishes. They're part of the same problem. And the whole concept is at the end of this thing, the Messiah will finally eradicate this, and we will have peace on earth for 1,000 years. So I think that's where we're going, but some of the texts are kind of hard to pinpoint which exactly a time period, because some of them may have happened and others definitely have not. And they may be directly related and may not. So it's a lot easier once something happens to say, hey, that, so many days from this date was that date, and that is what happened. That's got to be correct. So that's the main idea behind that. But the war scroll is kind of confusing.
Yeah, I agree. Another one and I know you didn't write about this one either in this book, but another one that I was curious about, and I wrote a section in my book about it, but this one I don't know what to do with this one either. The Temple Scroll, which is interesting, but when you actually do the measurements and stuff, it doesn't seem to match the end of Ezekiel with that temple. Doesn't seem to match any of the other temples. What's your main takeaway from the Temple Scroll? What do you think we're looking at there? Is this something prophetic? Is this something that was planned but never built? What's your take?
Yeah, the temple, like the New Jerusalem text or the actual
Right.
temple scroll.
Oh, right,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sometimes I get those mixed. Yeah. Sorry.
yeah. The New Jerusalem text, I talk a lot about it, and sometimes some of the texts sound a lot like the description in Revelation,
Yeah.
but then they are different. So it is interesting to see, and I'm not sure why there'd be differences. I would trust the New Testament first,
Hmm.
and these could be commentaries. Some of the scrolls have been. I forget exactly the word for it, but when you're writing out your own stuff and you're like a student, and you're writing your first trimester type stuff. So in that case, we could have something that's got typos in it. For instance, I remember in one place in Justin Martyr, which is church father, not scroll, but he said something about the Antichrist comes and attacks and rules for 2.5 years. Now, there's another place, several other places, where he says 3.5 years. So it's just got to be a typo, for instance. So a lot of times when it comes to numbers, a lot of things get messed up. The stories are usually perfect, but the numbers kind of get confused. So I'm not sure exactly how to do that either. I think we'll
Yeah.
figure it out eventually.
Yeah, I think so too. If not on this side of the second coming of Christ, on the other side of it, and I can't wait for that. So to end here, let's talk about you have the Gaza plague. We hear a lot about stuff going on in Israel right now, and like you mentioned, you would have expected this to happen a couple years from now when we were in our final jubilee, but it seems like it happened early. Is there anything in the Bible or in the scrolls that explains what's happening right now in Israel, how this is going to pan out, and what we can expect in the Middle East in the next, say, few years or so?
There might be. There's a couple of things. Like there's one place that talks about a plague coming from Gaza, and there's other scrolls and Bible passages even that talk about Hamas being a government structure in the Gaza Strip, and all these other things that are going on. The prophecies of the wars that happen with Israel and southern Lebanon, and even Iran. Iran is mentioned in some of the scrolls too, not just in Jeremiah 49. But pulling all that together, one of the things I thought was interesting is there is a text that talks about a 70-year period. And at first, you're looking at that going, well, it must be the Babylonian period. But it doesn't seem to be like that. It seems to be talking about Israel comes back, and then there is a 70-year period and something happens. It's got something to do with a breach of contract. And so I started looking at it, and it's like, well, if it was 1948, that's over and nothing happened. So I don't know what that would be. So I just kind of keep going down to see what happens. one of the things I thought fascinating was the idea that Israel comes back as a very small state in the middle, and everybody around, they have no authority technically around them. But then as they expand, and this is the way it happened back when they first came into the land, they were told that I'm not giving you the whole thing because the wild animals would just go crazy. And so you need to expand slowly over a few hundred years. And so the same kind of thing is going on here. So they expand, and one of the wars after 1948 was the Suez Crisis. And the Suez Crisis was a thing in Egypt. They got it fixed and got done with it. But Egypt controlled Gaza at the time, and then Israel took it over. Well, as soon as the problem was over, they pretty much just gave it back for political pressure. But technically, if it's their land and they were able to control it, the bottom line is you don't give it back. So that would definitely be a breach of contract. So that would have to be fixed somewhere along the line. And there's been a couple times where they've taken it over, and then they've given it Ariel Sharon in 2005, I believe, gave them independence, and then we had all this problem start. So one of the things I thought was interesting is that Suez Crisis was 1956. So 1956 plus 70 years is 2026. The Hamas war started in 23, and now it's 24. So the bottom line is they're saying there's no way it would be over this year. Well, maybe if it was just, everybody stayed out of it and they could just finish this one war. But if Hezbollah is going to hop in and or Iran or anything else, it's not going to be this year. So that would mean they're kind of expecting or hoping it to be done somewhere in the middle of 2025, somewhere like that. But if it's even 6 months further, that would be 2026. So it'd be really interesting to me to see if 1956 was the mistake and 2026 is a permanent solution. That would be fascinating. And of course, the 70-year count might be something else. Another thing that they did wrong is in 1967, they took back the Temple Mount, and then they promptly handed it back again. So 70 years from 1967 would be 2047, I think it is, or 37, something like that. That's a long ways out, though. I'd rather the rapture and everything happen quicker. But you never know. I mean, I remember my parents thinking it can't get worse than this, and that was back in the early 80s. And now it's been 40 some years since then. So anyway, but there's things like that in there. So the idea of a Gentile king, and one of the things I thought was interesting was in the book of Revelation. It talks about, remember the two beasts, one's
Yeah.
from the land, one's from the sea. And Revelation actually says the sea is all the different peoples, nations, the Gentiles, basically. And that makes you think the land beast is probably Israel. If it's all these people and then one people, it'd have to be Israel and Gentiles. So that's fine. But the interesting thing about it was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's talking about these things, and it was saying when people come up out of the sea, specifically, it is the Gentile groups, but the Gentile groups are always headed by somebody. And in the way they interpret it is it's headed by Rome. So there'd be a revived Roman Empire of something. And the guy heading this is like an Antichrist figure or something along those lines. So to say it's Gentile and it's Antichrist and it's Rome and it's from the Gentile nations and it's a large coalition coming against, Israel. And apparently there's a false prophet type person in Israel, if you interpret it like that. So it gives us to me anyway, a slight twist or more information on maybe how to interpret Revelation. We might look a little closer of these things, but the wars are fascinating. And one of the things that I've always thought about also is this with the Nephilim idea. I've always said because the old texts talk about the Nephilim being a problem, they all got wiped out in the flood, and there never was another incursion. We're done. And the question is, well, then where did they come from in Canaan? Well, the history text say you get a human being reading the text on how they did their experiments, you recreate it, and all of a sudden now you got giants in Canaan. So it's a human recreation type thing. But so there's texts that talk about the technology at least coming back, and we're warned about, Nephilim type medicine. So in the end times, you'll have doctors that want to change your genes to fix all the problems. And that's where you're supposed to stop and say, no, it's not just a pill, an antibiotic or something. You're talking about fundamentally changing who I am. And that begins to get into Nephilim concepts. And so one of the things was interesting was this one scroll, I think it's 4Q 530.
Yep. Yeah, you have it titled as End Time Nephilim. Yeah.
Yeah. It's there's a lot of right before the flood, a lot of them had dreams of a coming flood and everything was destroyed. In this one, though, it's a little different because everything is destroyed, but there are gardeners that come and snip out some of the roots, and the roots make it through and survive until a fire comes and destroys them. So that would be second coming. So we have the possibility, not even necessarily Nephilim like before, but at the very least, something from them, the technology comes back or has always been here somewhere. So it's interesting to see all that. So we're warned about being moral. We're warned about paying attention closely to prophecy, not dividing over it, but watching for everything, and then also watching our health. I mean, number one, if I do live to be 100 or 120, I don't want to be bedridden. I want to be healthy, and when I'm no longer healthy, I want to go home. So that's one thing that I'm after here. But to see all of that ingrained in the scrolls, it's like a community concept. This is when it gets bad, you best be doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a really neat design, I think, for us to follow in the end times.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's what's so exciting about the scrolls because, like, you read it and it's like, wow, we're here. Like, time's getting really short. It is definitely time to get right with Jesus if you're not already. Well, I can't even. I wouldn't be able to think of a better place to end on. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Always is when you come on the show. Thank you so much for coming back on and talking with us about your new book.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. And thank all of you for joining us yet again. Thank you for being members at Daily Renegade. We really appreciate you. And until next time, love you all. Take care and God bless.